The emergence of what would later crystallize into the institution of knighthood in England began not with the dramatic Norman invasion of 1066, but through the gradual evolution of military practices and social structures that characterized the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms during the centuries preceding the conquest. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's dive in. The concept of mounted warriors serving powerful lords had existed in various forms throughout early medieval Europe, but the specific combination of military function, social status, and cultural ideology that defined English knighthood required particular historical circumstances to coalesce into a recognizable institution. The Anglo-Saxon military system that dominated England from the 5th through 11th centuries operated according to principles fundamentally different from the feudal structures that would later characterize knightly service, yet it contained elements that would prove essential for the development of mounted warrior elites. The fyrd, the general military levy that could be summoned by Anglo-Saxon kings and their subordinate lords, represented the primary defensive force available to early English kingdoms, drawing upon free men who owed military service as a condition of their land, tenure, or social status. This system enabled Anglo-Saxon rulers to raise substantial infantry forces for defensive campaigns, but it proved less effective for offensive operations requiring sustained military commitments or specialized tactical capabilities. The Vegnans, a class of aristocratic warriors who held land directly from the king or from powerful nobles, constituted the professional core of Anglo-Saxon military forces, maintaining horses and equipment that enabled them to respond rapidly to military threats, while providing their lords with a reliable force of trained fighters. These mounted warriors, though serving functions that superficially resembled later knightly service, operated within a social and cultural framework that emphasized personal loyalty and gift-giving relationships, rather than the formalized feudal obligations that would characterize Norman and Angevin England. The military equipment employed by Anglo-Saxon mounted warriors reflected both the technological capabilities of early medieval metalworking and the tactical doctrines that governed English warfare during this period. The byrnie, a shirt of interlocking iron rings that provided protection against cutting weapons while allowing reasonable freedom of movement, represented the most sophisticated defensive armor available to wealthy warriors, though its manufacture required such extensive labor and specialized knowledge that only the most prosperous Thegnes could afford such protection. The conical helmet with its distinctive nasal guard, often decorated with bronze or precious metals for high-status warriors, offered protection for the head, while the attached face guard shielded the nose from downward sword strikes that might otherwise prove devastating in close combat. The weapons carried by these mounted warriors included the spatha, a long double-edged sword descended from Roman cavalry weapons, which served as both a practical combat tool and a symbol of aristocratic status that could be passed down through generations as treasured family heirlooms. The seax, a single-edged fighting knife that gave the Saxons their name, provided a backup weapon for close combat situations while serving various practical purposes in daily life that made it ubiquitous across all social classes. Anglo-Saxon shields, constructed from wooden planks bound together and faced with leather, featured iron bosses at their centers that protected the hand grip while potentially serving as striking weapons in their own right, though the shield's primary function remained defensive protection during the close quarters combat that dominated early medieval warfare. The military tactics employed by Anglo-Saxon forces reflected the limitations and advantages of their equipment and social organization, emphasizing disciplined infantry formations that could maintain cohesion during defensive battles, while proving less effective in the pursuit of defeated enemies or in offensive campaigns requiring sustained cavalry operations. The shield wall, the fundamental tactical formation of Anglo-Saxon warfare, required warriors to stand shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping, creating a continuous barrier that could resist frontal assaults while providing mutual protection for the men comprising the formation. This defensive tactic proved devastatingly effective when Anglo-Saxon forces occupied strong positions and maintained their formation discipline, as demonstrated during numerous battles against Viking invaders throughout the 9th and 10th centuries. However, the shield wall's inherent immobility and vulnerability to flank attacks created significant tactical limitations that more mobile cavalry-based armies could exploit through maneuver and coordination that was beyond the capabilities of infantry formations, lacking mounted support. The social organization of Anglo-Saxon military forces reflected the hierarchical structure of early English society, with kings and powerful nobles commanding the personal loyalty of their vegnans, who in turn could summon the military service of free men holding land within their jurisdictions. This system of nested obligations created military forces whose cohesion depended heavily on personal relationships and the maintenance of gift-giving cycles that bound warriors to their lords through reciprocal exchanges of service and reward. The comitatus, the warband of elite warriors who served in the immediate household of a powerful lord, represented the highest expression of this personal military relationship, with warriors pledging absolute loyalty to their commander in exchange for maintenance, equipment, and the opportunity to gain wealth and status through successful military campaigns. The cultural ideals that governed Anglo-Saxon warrior society emphasized courage, loyalty, and generosity, values that would later find expression in the chivalric codes of the High Middle Ages, though the specific manifestations and social contexts of these ideals differed significantly between the two periods. Anglo-Saxon poetry, particularly works like Beowulf and the Battle of Maldon, preserved idealized images of warrior conduct that emphasized the importance of maintaining reputation through brave deeds, the obligation to avenge slain kinsmen and lords, and the necessity of generous gift-giving to maintain the bonds between warriors and their commanders. These cultural values, transmitted through oral tradition and eventually recorded in written form by monastic scribes, shaped the behavior and self-conception of Anglo-Saxon military elites, while providing models of conduct that influenced subsequent generations of English warriors. The relationship between Anglo-Saxon military elites and the Christian Church developed gradually throughout the period of English conversion, creating tensions between traditional warrior values and Christian teachings that would persist throughout the medieval period and profoundly influence the development of knightly ideology. The Church's promotion of concepts like the peace of God and the truce of God, which sought to limit warfare and protect non-combatants from violence, challenged traditional assumptions about the legitimacy of aristocratic violence, while creating space for new ideologies that could reconcile military service with Christian virtue. Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots, often drawn from aristocratic families with strong military traditions, attempted to channel warrior energies toward religiously sanctioned objectives like the defense of Christian communities and the suppression of paganism, creating precedents for the later concept of the Christian knight fighting in defense of the faith. The military challenges facing Anglo-Saxon England during the 9th and 10th centuries, particularly the sustained Viking invasions that threatened to destroy English political independence and cultural identity, drove significant innovations in military organization and defensive strategy that would influence the development of medieval English warfare. Alfred the Great's military reforms during the late 9th century included the construction of a network of fortified burhs that provided defended positions throughout Wessex, the division of military forces to ensure that some troops remained available for defense while others attended to agricultural duties, and the development of a naval force capable of intercepting Viking raiders before they reached the English coast. These reforms required unprecedented levels of administrative coordination and resource mobilization, establishing precedents for royal military authority that would prove crucial for later medieval English kings attempting to maintain effective military forces. The reunification of England under the West Saxon dynasty during the 10th century created a kingdom of unprecedented size and administrative sophistication, yet the military system that had enabled this achievement proved inadequate when confronted with the renewed Viking invasions of the late 10th and early 11th centuries. The reign of Aethelred, the Unready, characterized by military failures and the payment of massive Danegeld tributes to Viking forces demonstrated the limitations of traditional Anglo-Saxon military organization when facing sustained pressure from well-organized and tactically flexible enemies. The eventual conquest of England by the Danish king Canute in 1016 established a brief period of Anglo-Scandinavian rule that introduced new military practices and cultural influences. Though the fundamental structures of Anglo-Saxon society and military organization remained largely intact, the restoration of the West Saxon dynasty under Edward the Confessor in 1042 appeared to promise a return to traditional English governance. Yet Edward's long exile in Normandy had exposed him to continental military practices and social structures that would significantly influence his reign and create the conditions for the Norman Conquest that would transform English to society. Edward's introduction of Norman favourites to positions of authority in England, his construction of Westminster Abbey in the Norman Romanesque style, and his apparent designation of William of Normandy as his heir created tensions with traditional Anglo-Saxon nobles who viewed these continental influences as threats to their power and status. The succession crisis that followed Edward's death in early January of 1066 set in motion a series of military confrontations that would fundamentally alter the structure of English society and establish the institutional foundations for the development of knighthood in England. Harold Godwinson's seizure of the English throne, immediately upon Edward's death, violated what William of Normandy claimed were solemn oaths of allegiance, providing the Norman Duke with a legal and moral justification for military intervention that would prove crucial for securing papal support and recruiting warriors from across northern France. The military preparations that William undertook during the spring and summer of 1066 demonstrated organizational capabilities and strategic vision that far exceeded anything possible within traditional Anglo-Saxon military structures. As the Duke assembled a fleet of transport vessels, recruited thousands of mounted warriors from Normandy and neighboring territories, and accumulated the provisions and equipment necessary for a major amphibious invasion, the invasion force that William assembled at Dives-sur-Mer during August of 1066 included not only his own Norman vassals, but also adventurous warriors from Brittany, Flanders, and other regions of northern France, attracted by promises of land and plunder in England, as well as by the spiritual benefits associated with a campaign that had received papal blessing. The composition of this invasion force, heavily weighted toward mounted warriors equipped and trained for cavalry combat, contrasted sharply with the infantry-focused military organization of Anglo-Saxon England, creating tactical asymmetries that would prove decisive during the campaign's crucial battles. The delay in William's crossing, caused by unfavorable winds that kept his fleet confined to port throughout August and early September, inadvertently contributed to his ultimate success by forcing Harold Godwinson to maintain his defensive forces in southern England, even as a separate Norwegian invasion threatened the north. Harold Hardrada's invasion of northern England in early September of 1066, launched in alliance with Harold Godwinson's rebellious brother Tostig, achieved initial success by defeating a northern English army at the Battle of Fulford on September 20th. But this victory proved short-lived when Harold Godwinson force-marched his army north and destroyed the Norwegian forces at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th. Harold's decisive victory at Stamford Bridge eliminated the Norwegian threat and demonstrated the continued effectiveness of Anglo-Saxon military methods when properly employed. Yet the exhaustion of his forces and the immediate need to march south to confront William's landing created conditions that would severely disadvantage the English king during the subsequent confrontation. William's landing at Pevensey on September 28th faced no opposition, as Harold's forces remained in the north, and the local levies of southern England had been dismissed after spending the summer on defensive watch, allowing the Norman Duke to establish a secure beachhead and begin ravaging the surrounding countryside to provoke Harold into battle. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14th of 1066, constituted one of the most consequential military engagements in English history, determining not only the political control of the kingdom, but also initiating social and cultural transformations that would reshape every aspect of English life. Harold's army, exhausted from its rapid march south and significantly reduced in numbers by casualties at Stamford Bridge and the inability of many troops to complete the journey, nevertheless occupied a strong defensive position on Senlac Hill, where the traditional shield wall formation could maximize English strengths while minimizing the advantages of Norman cavalry. The battle opened with Norman archery barrages and infantry assaults that failed to break the English shield wall, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of traditional Anglo-Saxon defensive tactics when properly employed on favorable terrain. However, the Norman cavalry's ability to withdraw, regroup, and launch repeated charges gradually wore down the English formation, while feigned retreats drew undisciplined English warriors from their defensive positions, where they could be cut down by wheeling cavalry units that exploited the broken formation. The death of Harold Godwinson late in the day, whether from an arrow to the eye, as later tradition claimed, or from wounds received during the cavalry melees that characterized the battle's final phase, broke English resistance and transformed a defensive stalemate into a catastrophic defeat that left the kingdom leaderless and vulnerable to Norman conquest. The immediate aftermath of Hastings saw the surviving English nobility attempt to organize resistance around Edgar the Atheling, the last male member of the West Saxon royal line, but the lack of effective military leadership and the shock of the catastrophic defeat made sustained resistance impossible. William's methodical advance on London, marked by the systematic devastation of the countryside through which his army passed, demonstrated both his determination to secure complete submission and his understanding that the destruction of economic resources would make further resistance practically impossible. The submission of the English nobility at Berkhamsted in late December of 1066, followed by William's coronation as King of England on Christmas Day, formally established Norman rule over England, though effective control of the kingdom would require years of additional military campaigning to suppress regional resistance and impose new administrative structures. The Norman settlement of England proceeded through a combination of military occupation, the systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon landholders with Norman nobles, and the construction of castles that provided secure bases for Norman military power while physically manifesting the new political order. The redistribution of land that followed the conquest saw virtually the entire Anglo-Saxon aristocracy dispossessed and replaced by Norman and French nobles, who held their estates as fiefs granted by William in exchange for military service, establishing the feudal landholding system that would characterize English society for centuries. This transformation represented not merely a change of personnel, but a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between landholding and military obligation, as the new Norman lords owed William clearly defined quotas of mounted warriors that they were required to provide for royal military campaigns, creating the institutional foundation for the development of knighthood in England. The castle-building program that accompanied the Norman settlement transformed the English landscape and established permanent centers of Norman military power that could dominate surrounding territories, even with relatively small garrison forces. The earliest Norman castles in England, constructed rapidly using earth and timber, featured the motte and bailey design that had proven effective in Normandy, with a wooden tower atop an artificial mound overlooking an enclosed courtyard that housed support buildings and provided refuge for the garrison and local population during attacks. These fortifications, though simple in construction, provided formidable defensive advantages through their elevated positions and the difficulty of assaulting steep-sided mottes, while defenders showered attackers with missiles from the tower above. The evolution of castle design during the late 11th and early 12th centuries saw many timber structures replaced with stone, creating permanent fortifications that required specialized siege equipment and sustained operations to capture, while the development of more sophisticated defensive features like concentric walls, flanking towers, and improved gatehouses made castles increasingly difficult to assault directly. The White Tower in London, begun around 1078, exemplified the Norman approach to castle architecture through its massive stone construction, sophisticated residential accommodations for the royal household, and symbolic function as a demonstration of Norman power at the heart of the conquered kingdom. The military obligations that Norman landholders owed to the king became codified through the feudal system of knight service, which required tenants-in-chief to provide specified numbers of fully equipped mounted warriors for royal military campaigns, typically for 40 days of service per year. These quotas, known as servitium debitum, varied based on the size and value of the estates held, with major landholders owing service of dozens or even hundreds of knights, while smaller tenants might owe only a few warriors or portions of a knight's service that would be combined with obligations from other small tenants. The implementation of this system required the subdivision of large estates into smaller holdings granted to military tenants who would perform the actual knight service owed by the tenant-in-chief, creating a hierarchy of feudal relationships that extended from the king through multiple levels of lords and vassals to the individual knights who constituted the basic units of military service. The process by which Norman lords established this system of military tenancies involved granting portions of their estates to warriors who had participated in the conquest or who were recruited from Normandy and other continental regions during the decades following 1066, creating a new class of landholding warriors whose social position and economic resources derived entirely from their military function. These early knights, often men of relatively modest origins who had gained land through military service, occupied ambiguous social positions that reflected their essential military functions without yet possessing the aristocratic status and cultural prestige that would later characterize knighthood. The equipment and training required for effective cavalry combat created significant economic barriers that ensured knight service remained restricted to landholders with sufficient resources to maintain horses, armor, and weapons while practicing the specialized skills necessary for mounted warfare. The destrier, the specialized warhorse trained for cavalry combat, represented a substantial investment that required years of breeding and training to produce animals with the size, temperament, and training necessary for battlefield service, while the maintenance of multiple horses for different purposes added considerably to the costs of knightly service. The hauberk, the long shirt of mail armor that protected the torso and arms of Norman knights, required hundreds of hours of skilled labor to manufacture, with individual iron rings hammered from wire and linked together in patterns that provided flexibility while maintaining protective coverage. The cost of a complete set of knightly equipment, including horses, armor, weapons, and support personnel, represented several years' income from a typical knight's holding, ensuring that only substantial landholders could maintain themselves in proper military readiness. The training necessary for effective mounted combat required years of practice beginning in childhood, as young boys destined for knightly service learned horsemanship, weapon handling, and the tactical coordination necessary for cavalry operations through a combination of formal instruction and practical experience. The cultural transformation that accompanied the Norman settlement of England proceeded gradually through the replacement of Anglo-Saxon cultural practices with Norman customs, the dominance of the French language among the aristocracy, and the introduction of continental architectural styles and artistic traditions. The systematic replacement of Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots with Norman clerics transformed the English Church into an instrument of Norman cultural and political dominance, while introducing continental reform movements that sought to align English religious practices with Roman standards. The construction of massive Norman cathedrals and abbey churches in the Romanesque style, characterized by round arches, massive walls, and geometric decoration, created permanent monuments to Norman power while establishing architectural precedents that would influence English building for generations. The introduction of the French language, as the primary medium of aristocratic discourse, created a linguistic division that would persist for centuries, with French serving as the language of government, law, and refined culture, while English survived as the speech of common people, gradually absorbing French vocabulary and grammatical influences that would transform its structure. The compilation of Domesday Book in 1086 provided William with comprehensive information about the economic resources of his kingdom, while documenting the extent of the Norman transformation of English landholding patterns, as the survey revealed that virtually all significant estates had passed from Anglo-Saxon to Norman control within 2 decades of the conquest. This remarkable administrative achievement, which recorded the ownership, value, and resources of estates throughout most of England, demonstrated the sophistication of Norman governance while providing the king with information necessary for assessing military obligations and tax revenues. The resistance to Norman rule that continued sporadically throughout William's reign, including significant rebellions in the north during 1069 and 1070, prompted brutal military responses that devastated large regions and established the futility of armed opposition to Norman power. The harrying of the north during the winter of 1069 to 1070, which involved the systematic destruction of food supplies, livestock, and agricultural infrastructure across Yorkshire and neighbouring regions, created a man-made famine that killed thousands and left large areas depopulated for decades, demonstrating William's determination to crush resistance regardless of the human cost. The military effectiveness of Norman cavalry during these campaigns against regional rebellions established the tactical superiority of mounted warriors over traditional infantry formations, when cavalry could operate in terrain that permitted maneuver and when opposition forces lacked the discipline and equipment necessary to maintain effective shield walls. The evolution of the knight's role during the reigns of William's sons, William, Rufus, and Henry I, saw the gradual transformation of knighthood from a purely military function into a social status with increasingly defined cultural expectations and aristocratic pretensions. The civil war between William Rufus and his older brother Robert Curthose, who had inherited the Duchy of Normandy, required both sides to maintain substantial forces of knights, creating opportunities for military advancement while demonstrating the continuing importance of heavy cavalry in the warfare of the late 11th century. Henry I's seizure of the English throne following William Rufus's death in August of 1100 initiated a reign characterized by administrative innovation and the systematic development of governmental institutions that would transform the relationship between the monarchy and its knightly tenants. The establishment of the Exchequer during Henry's reign created a bureaucratic system for managing royal finances and recording the obligations owed by tenants-in-chief, including their quotas of knight service, while the development of the system of royal justices, who travelled circuits to hear cases, established mechanisms for royal authority that operated independently of traditional feudal relationships. The military challenges of Henry's reign, including the need to defend Normandy against French aggression and to suppress rebellions in England, required the maintenance of substantial military forces while demonstrating the limitations of traditional feudal service for campaigns requiring sustained operations or extended service beyond the customary 40-day period. The practice of scutage, which allowed knights to pay cash in lieu of personal military service, emerged during this period as a practical solution to the Crown's need for flexibility in military recruitment, enabling the king to hire professional soldiers for extended campaigns while providing knights with an alternative to personal service that might interfere with estate management. The death of Henry's legitimate son William Adelin in the White Ship disaster of November 25, 1120, created a succession crisis that would plunge England into civil war and fundamentally demonstrate the political importance of military force in determining royal authority. Henry's designation of his daughter Matilda as his heir challenged traditional assumptions about female succession and generated opposition from barons who doubted a woman's ability to command their military service effectively. While the rival claim of Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, provided an alternative focus for those who opposed Matilda's succession, the civil war that erupted following Henry's death in December of 1135, known as the Anarchy, lasted nearly 2 decades and demonstrated both the military capabilities of the knightly class and the devastating effects of unrestricted aristocratic warfare on civilian populations. Stephen's seizure of the English throne immediately after Henry's death appeared initially successful, as most English barons accepted his kingship and provided the military support necessary to secure control of the kingdom. Yet Matilda's invasion in 1139 initiated a prolonged conflict characterized by shifting alliances and inconclusive military campaigns. The military operations during the Anarchy typically involved sieges of castles held by opposing factions, with pitched battles remaining relatively rare due to the risks involved and the preference for reducing enemy strongpoints through blockade or negotiated surrender. The proliferation of unauthorized castle construction during this period, as barons built fortifications without royal permission to secure their territories and enhance their military capabilities, created a landscape of competing power centers that would require decades to bring under royal control, even after the war's conclusion. The Battle of Lincoln, on February 2nd, 1141, demonstrated the continuing effectiveness of cavalry charges in medieval warfare, while highlighting the risks of mounted combat, as Stephen's forces achieved initial success through a coordinated cavalry assault, before being overwhelmed by Matilda's larger army that captured the king and briefly secured her military supremacy. Matilda's subsequent failure to maintain control, culminating in her expulsion from London and the capture of her chief military commander, Robert of Gloucester, at the rout of Winchester in September 1141, demonstrated the difficulty of translating military success into stable political authority without the administrative infrastructure and baronial support necessary for effective governance. The eventual resolution of the Civil War through the Treaty of Wallingford in November of 1153, which recognized Stephen as king while designating Matilda's son Henry as his heir, reflected the war-weariness of the baronial class and their recognition that continued conflict served no one's interests. The accession of Henry II in October of 1154 initiated the Angevin period of English history and brought to the throne a ruler whose extensive continental possessions and administrative capabilities would significantly influence the development of English institutions, including the organization and culture of knighthood. Henry's continental empire, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees and including England, Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, and various other territories, required military forces capable of operating across this vast domain while maintaining sufficient strength in each region to deter aggression from the French king and other rivals. The military reforms that Henry implemented during his reign reflected both the lessons of the anarchy and his determination to establish effective royal control over baronial military power, including the systematic destruction of unauthorized castles built during the Civil War and the restriction of castle construction to those with explicit royal permission. The Assize of Arms of 1181 established detailed requirements for the military equipment that free men of various social ranks were required to maintain, creating a framework for military mobilization that supplemented feudal knight service with forces drawn from broader segments of the population. This legislation specified that knights and those holding land worth £16 annually must maintain a full complement of knightly equipment, including hauberk, helmet, shield, and lance, while men of lesser means were required to maintain equipment appropriate to their resources, ranging from simple spears and padded gambesons for the poorest freemen to more substantial arms for wealthy townsmen and minor landholders. The development of the royal household knights during Henry's reign created a permanent force of professional warriors who served the king directly rather than through feudal obligations, receiving wages and other benefits in exchange for continuous military service that exceeded the traditional limitations of feudal service. These household knights, drawn from younger sons of noble families and landless warriors seeking to establish themselves through military service, formed the core of royal armies during Henry's numerous campaigns, while providing a model of professional military service that would gradually supplement and eventually supplant traditional feudal levies. The judicial reforms of Henry's reign, including the establishment of common law courts and the expansion of royal justice at the expense of baronial and ecclesiastical jurisdictions, had significant implications for the knightly class by creating alternative sources of royal authority and reducing the independent military power of individual lords. The constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, which attempted to define the relationship between royal and ecclesiastical courts, demonstrated Henry's determination to establish royal supremacy over all sources of jurisdiction, though the subsequent conflict with Archbishop Thomas Becket over clerical immunity from secular justice revealed the practical limitations of royal power when confronting entrenched institutional privileges. The murder of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170, by 4 knights from Henry's household, who interpreted his angry words as a command to eliminate the troublesome archbishop, demonstrated the violent capabilities of the knightly class while creating a political crisis that required Henry to perform public penance and make concessions to ecclesiastical authority. The military campaigns that characterized Henry's reign, including repeated wars with the French king over control of contested territories, expeditions to suppress rebellions in his continental lands, and the invasion of Ireland in 1171, provided extensive combat experience for English knights, while establishing the professional military culture that would characterize the English knightly class during the High Middle Ages. The Great Revolt of 1173 to 1174, which saw Henry's sons rebel against him, with support from the French king, the King of Scotland, and numerous continental and English barons, tested the military effectiveness of royal household forces against feudal levies and demonstrated the advantages of professional soldiers over traditional feudal armies. Henry's ultimate success in suppressing this widespread revolt, achieved through a combination of military skill, strategic mobility enabled by his household knights, and the defensive capabilities of loyal castles that denied rebels control of crucial strongpoints, confirmed the effectiveness of his military reforms while establishing precedents for royal control over baronial military power. The military role of knights during the later 12th century began to evolve beyond simple cavalry charges toward more sophisticated tactical applications that reflected both technological changes in armor and weapons and the growing professionalism of military service. The gradual improvement in armor technology during this period, including the development of mail chassis that protected the legs and the addition of mail mittens attached to the hauberk sleeves, increased the protection available to knights, while adding to the weight and cost of military equipment. The helm, a flat-topped cylindrical helmet that fully enclosed the head and face, began to supplement or replace the earlier conical helmets, providing superior protection against the increasingly powerful weapons employed in combat, while restricting vision and breathing in ways that made these helmets practical only for the actual moments of combat. The adoption of the couched lance technique, which involved holding the lance tucked under the arm rather than wielded overhead, enabled knights to deliver devastating charges that utilized the combined momentum of horse and rider, while requiring extensive training to master the balance and timing necessary for effective use. The development of tournaments during the late 11th and early 12th centuries provided knights with opportunities to practice cavalry combat skills, while gaining prestige and material rewards through successful performance in these mock battles. The earliest tournaments, held in northern France during the mid-11th century, involved melees between teams of knights fighting across open countryside, with few rules restricting combat, and the primary objective being to capture opposing knights for ransom. These violent contests, which regularly resulted in serious injuries and occasional deaths, provided valuable combat training while enabling successful knights to gain substantial wealth through the capture and ransom of defeated opponents. The spread of tournaments to England during the late 12th century occurred despite periodic royal prohibitions, motivated by concerns that these gatherings of armed knights might facilitate rebellions, or that the injuries and deaths resulting from tournament combat depleted military resources needed for actual warfare. William Marshall, the most celebrated knight of the late 12th and early 13th centuries, built his early career and fortune through tournament success, reportedly capturing over 500 knights during his years on the tournament circuit, before entering royal service and eventually rising to become Regent of England. The cultural significance of tournaments extended beyond their practical military training functions to encompass increasingly elaborate social rituals that celebrated knightly prowess and provided venues for aristocratic display, courtly behavior. The development of chivalric literature during the late 12th century, particularly the Arthurian romances of Chrétien de Troyes and other courtly authors, created idealized images of knightly conduct that emphasized not only military prowess, but also refined manners, devotion to ladies, and adherence to codes of honor that constrained aristocratic violence. These literary works, composed for aristocratic audiences and often performed at courts and in castle halls, shaped the self-conception of the knightly class by providing models of behavior that combined martial valor with courtly refinement and Christian virtue. The concept of courtly love, which celebrated the knight's devotion to an idealized and often unattainable lady, introduced romantic elements into knightly culture that existed in tension with the violent realities of medieval warfare and the practical political marriages that characterized aristocratic society. The religious dimensions of knightly ideology during the late 12th century reflected the Church's long-standing efforts to channel aristocratic violence toward religiously sanctioned objectives, finding their fullest expression in the crusading movement that sought to recapture Jerusalem and other holy places from Muslim control. The fall of Jerusalem to Saladin in October of 1187 prompted the Third Crusade, which saw King Richard I of England, who had succeeded his father Henry in July of 1189, embark on a campaign that would establish his reputation as the epitome of knightly virtue while nearly bankrupting his kingdom. Richard's military campaigns during the Third Crusade, including the capture of Cyprus in May of 1191, the siege and recapture of Acre in July of 1191, and the victory at the Battle of Arsuf on September 7, 1191, demonstrated both the military effectiveness of Western knights in Eastern warfare and the logistical challenges of sustaining military operations thousands of miles from home bases. The Battle of Arsuf revealed Richard's tactical genius and his understanding of how to maximize the effectiveness of knightly cavalry, as he restrained his knights from charging prematurely despite heavy pressure from Saladin's forces, waiting until Muslim cavalry had exhausted themselves against his infantry formations before launching a devastating coordinated charge that routed the enemy army. Richard's reputation as a military commander and exemplar of knightly virtue derived not only from his tactical skills and personal bravery, but also from his adherence to the cultural codes that governed aristocratic warfare, including his respectful treatment of Saladin as a worthy opponent and his reputation for keeping promises even when doing so imposed costs. The military developments during Richard's reign, including his extensive castle-building projects and his refinement of siege warfare techniques, reflected his deep understanding of contemporary military technology and his willingness to invest enormous resources in maintaining military superiority. The construction of Château Gaillard in Normandy, built between 1196 and 1198 at enormous expense, incorporated the most advanced defensive features of contemporary military architecture, including concentric fortifications, machicolations for dropping projectiles on attackers, and a sophisticated system of flanking towers that eliminated blind spots in the defences. The accession of John to the English throne following Richard's death in April of 1199 initiated a reign that would be characterized by military failures, political conflicts with the baronage, and ultimately the imposition of formal limitations on royal authority that would significantly affect the relationship between the crown and the knightly class. John's loss of Normandy and most other continental territories to the French king Philip Augustus between 1202 and 1204, culminating in the fall of Château Gaillard after an 8-month siege, represented a catastrophic military failure that demonstrated both the vulnerability of even the strongest castles to sustained siege operations and the consequences of inadequate military leadership. The financial demands that John imposed on his barons to fund attempted reconquests of his lost continental lands, combined with his arbitrary exercise of feudal rights and his conflicts with the Church over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, created a coalition of opposition that eventually forced him to accept limitations on royal authority. The baronial rebellion that erupted in early 1215 reflected accumulated grievances over John's financial exactions, his military failures, and his violations of customary feudal practices, with rebel barons demanding that the king confirm their rights and privileges through a written charter that would establish permanent limitations on royal authority. The Magna Carta, sealed by John at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, included numerous provisions that specifically addressed the concerns of the knightly class, including restrictions on the crown's ability to demand excessive military service, limitations on the levying of scutage without baronial consent, and protections against arbitrary seizures of property or imprisonment without legal process. The Charter's requirement that no free man could be punished except through the lawful judgment of his peers or the law of the land established a principle of legal procedure that would have lasting significance for English, constitutional development, though the immediate impact was limited by John's prompt repudiation of the Charter and the outbreak of renewed civil war. The civil war that followed John's rejection of Magna Carta saw rebel barons invite Prince Louis of France to invade England and claim the throne, creating a crisis that threatened to place England under French control and fundamentally alter the balance of power in Western Europe. John's death in October of 1216 during the midst of this civil war enabled a political settlement that secured the throne for his 9-year-old son Henry, with a regency government led by the aged but still capable William Marshal, who had served 4 previous kings and whose reputation for honour and military skill proved crucial for rallying support to the royalist cause. The victories of the royalist forces at the Battle of Lincoln on May 20th, 1217, where a relief force, led by William Marshal, routed the rebel army, besieging Lincoln Castle, and the naval Battle of Sandwich on August 24th, 1217, which destroyed French reinforcements sailing to support Louis's invasion, secured the throne for the young Henry III and established conditions for a political settlement. The reissuing of Magna Carta in modified form by the Regency government in November of 1217, which removed the most objectionable clauses from the king's perspective while maintaining core protections for baronial rights, established the Charter as a fundamental constitutional document that would be repeatedly reconfirmed throughout the 13th century. The long reign of Henry III, extending from his accession in 1216 to his death in 1272, saw significant developments in the organization and culture of knighthood, despite the king's generally weak military leadership and his conflicts with reformist barons seeking to limit royal authority. The military obligations of knighthood became increasingly burdensome during this period, as the costs of equipment and horses continued to rise, while the economic benefits of holding knights' fees declined due to agricultural stagnation and the crown's financial demands. The phenomenon of distraint of knighthood, whereby men holding land of sufficient value to support knightly service were compelled to accept formal knighthood and its attendant obligations, even if they preferred to avoid military service, reflected the crown's difficulty in maintaining adequate numbers of knights, as many landholders sought to evade the expensive responsibilities of knightly status. The development of a distinct class of men-at-arms, or sergeants who fought as heavy cavalry but lacked formal knightly status, created an intermediate military category that could provide some of the functions of knightly service, without requiring the full panoply of equipment and social status associated with knighthood proper. The military campaigns of Henry's reign, including repeated expeditions to defend the remaining English possessions in France and periodic interventions in Welsh affairs, demonstrated both the continuing importance of heavy cavalry in 13th century warfare and the growing significance of infantry forces equipped with longbows or crossbows. The evolution of armor technology during the 13th century saw the gradual addition of plate elements to supplement or replace mail protection in vulnerable areas, beginning with kneecaps and eventually extending to encompass full leg defenses, elbow protection, and reinforced gauntlets. The great helm, fully enclosing the head with a flat or slightly rounded top, became standard equipment for mounted combat, despite its severe restrictions on vision and breathing, with knights typically wearing lighter helmets during travel and only donning the great helm immediately before engaging in combat. The development of the coat of arms during the 12th and 13th centuries provided knights with systems of visual identification that were essential, given the fully enclosing helmets that made recognition impossible based on facial features. These heraldic devices, displayed on shields, surcoats, worn over armor, and horse trappings, evolved from simple geometric patterns and animal figures into complex systems of hereditary symbols governed by increasingly sophisticated rules that determined how arms could be combined through marriage or inheritance. The appointment of heralds as officials responsible for recording and verifying coats of arms, organizing tournaments, and serving as messengers during military campaigns formalized the heraldic system while creating a specialized bureaucracy devoted to maintaining the distinctions of aristocratic status. The social significance of heraldry extended beyond its practical military functions to encompass broader assertions of family identity and aristocratic status, with the right to bear arms becoming a defining characteristic of gentle birth that distinguished the nobility from common people. The Second Barons' War, which erupted in 1258, when a coalition of reformist barons, led by Simon de Montfort, sought to impose restrictions on royal authority through the provisions of Oxford, demonstrated both the military capabilities of the English baronage and the political tensions inherent in the feudal relationship between king and knights. The provisions established a council of 15 barons who would control royal government, requiring the king to obtain council approval for major decisions and effectively reducing him to a figurehead, though Henry's subsequent repudiation of these restrictions with papal support reignited the conflict. The Battle of Lewes on May 14, 1264, where Simon de Montfort's forces defeated and captured King Henry and his son Edward, despite being significantly outnumbered, demonstrated the importance of tactical skill and leadership in determining battle outcomes, regardless of numerical superiority. Simon's tactical disposition of his forces, which concealed part of his army in wooded areas where they could launch flank attacks on the royalist cavalry, and his success in maintaining infantry discipline despite the temptation to break formation when attacked by heavy cavalry, provided a model of how combined arms tactics could defeat forces relying primarily on mounted knights. The subsequent establishment of England's first elected parliament in January of 1265, which included not only barons and bishops but also knights of the shire and borough representatives, established precedents for broader political participation that would significantly influence English constitutional development. Though the immediate experiment in baronial government proved short-lived, Prince Edward's escape from custody in May of 1265 enabled him to rally royalist forces and reverse Simon's military successes through a campaign that culminated in the Battle of Evesham on August 4, 1265, where royalist forces surrounded and annihilated Simon's army, killing the baronial leader and effectively ending the rebellion. Edward's military successes during the Barons' War demonstrated both his tactical capabilities and his ruthless determination to secure total victory, as the battle at Evesham resulted in the systematic slaughter of the defeated baronial army, including men attempting to surrender, establishing Edward's reputation as a formidable military commander who would tolerate no challenges to royal authority. The accession of Edward I in November of 1272, following the death of his father Henry, while Edward was returning from crusade, brought to the throne a king whose military ambitions and administrative capabilities would significantly impact the development of English knighthood and military organization. Edward's conquest of Wales, conducted through systematic campaigns between 1277 and 1284, demonstrated his understanding of the importance of combining military force with administrative consolidation and the construction of permanent fortifications that could maintain English control over conquered territories. The military methods employed in the Welsh campaigns reflected Edward's willingness to utilize diverse forces suited to the specific tactical challenges of mountain warfare, including large contingents of infantry armed with spears and bows, cavalry forces that could pursue defeated Welsh armies, and engineers capable of constructing roads through mountainous terrain to enable supply trains to support extended operations. The construction of a ring of massive stone castles around the Welsh coastline, including the spectacular fortifications at Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris, required enormous financial resources and the recruitment of skilled craftsmen from across England and the continent, demonstrating Edward's determination to make permanent his conquest through architectural dominance as well as military force. The war with Scotland that dominated the last 2 decades of Edward's reign initiated a prolonged conflict that would continue intermittently for centuries and provide extensive combat experience for English knights, while demonstrating the limitations of heavy cavalry when confronting enemies employing defensive tactics suited to their home terrain. Edward's initial campaigns in Scotland, including his invasion of 1296 in response to Scottish rejection of his claims to overlordship, achieved rapid success through the use of overwhelming force and the capture of key Scottish strongpoints including Edinburgh and Stirling castles. The Scottish resistance that coalesced around William Wallace after his victory over an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge on September 11, 1297, demonstrated the vulnerability of traditional knightly cavalry to well-organized infantry forces, occupying strong defensive positions. Wallace's tactical innovations, which emphasized the use of schiltron formations of spearmen who maintained tight defensive circles that could resist cavalry charges while presenting walls of spear points that horses would not willingly approach, provided a model for infantry tactics that would influence Scottish military practice for generations. Edward's response to Wallace's tactics, most effectively demonstrated at the Battle of Falkirk on July 22, 1298, involved the coordinated use of archers to disrupt Scottish infantry formations before launching cavalry charges against troops whose cohesion had been broken by arrow fire. The employment of Welsh longbowmen in Edward's armies during the Scottish campaigns marked the beginning of a transition in English military organisation that would see missile weapons assume increasing importance relative to heavy cavalry during the 14th century. The longbow, capable of penetrating mail armour at close ranges and of shooting arrows at rapid rates that could disrupt enemy formations before they closed to contact range, provided English armies with significant tactical advantages when used in combination with dismounted men-at-arms who could hold defensive positions while archers broke enemy attacks. The military obligations of the English knightly class during Edward's reign became increasingly formalised through regular summonses to military service that specified the numbers of troops required and the locations where they should assemble, creating more systematic mobilization procedures than the ad hoc arrangements that had characterized earlier periods. The development of the feudal host, the army summoned through traditional feudal obligations, increasingly proved inadequate for Edward's military needs, leading to greater reliance on paid soldiers who would serve for wages beyond the traditional 40-day period of feudal service. The Military Service Acts of 1277 and 1285 attempted to broaden the basis of military recruitment by requiring men of specific wealth levels to maintain military equipment and serve in royal armies. When summoned, extending military obligations beyond those who held land through feudal tenure. The financial demands of Edward's wars, particularly the sustained campaigns in Scotland that required nearly continuous military operations during the final decade of his reign, created severe fiscal pressures that led to conflicts with the nobility and eventually forced the king to confirm Magna Carta and other limitations on royal authority in exchange for taxation to support his military ambitions. The practice of granting coats of arms and other marks of distinction to successful knights provided mechanisms for rewarding military service while reinforcing the connection between knightly status and martial achievement. Edward's death during his seventh invasion of Scotland in July of 1307 transferred the unresolved Scottish conflict to his son Edward II, whose military incompetence and political failures would discredit the institution of chivalric knighthood while demonstrating the limitations of cavalry-based warfare against enemies employing effective combined arms tactics. The continuation of the Scottish War under Edward II saw the English position steadily deteriorate as Robert Bruce consolidated his control over Scotland through a combination of guerrilla warfare and the systematic reduction of 22 English-held castles. The Battle of Bannockburn, fought over 2 days on June 23rd and 24th, 1314, constituted one of the most catastrophic English military defeats of the medieval period, destroying much of the English army, including significant numbers of knights and nobles, while establishing Scottish independence for generations. The English tactical approach at Bannockburn reflected Edward's poor military judgment and the overconfidence of English knights, who believed their cavalry charges would overwhelm the Scottish infantry regardless of the terrain, constraints and defensive preparations that limited their effectiveness. The Scottish use of schiltron formations positioned to control the approaches to Stirling Castle forced English cavalry to attack across broken ground and narrow fronts where they could not deploy effectively or utilize their numerical superiority. The second day's battle saw English forces trapped between the Scottish army and the Bannockburn stream, where the constricted terrain and muddy ground negated cavalry advantages, while Scottish spearmen could maintain formation integrity and present effective barriers to mounted attacks. The scale of the English defeat, which included the deaths of numerous nobles and knights, as well as the capture of many others for ransom, represented not only a military catastrophe, but also a devastating blow to the prestige of English knighthood and the assumptions about cavalry supremacy that had dominated military thinking. The political consequences of Bannockburn included the loss of English control over Scotland, the establishment of Robert Bruce's dynasty as legitimate Scottish rulers, and the emergence of Scotland as a significant military power capable of conducting raids into northern England with relative impunity. The domestic turmoil that characterized Edward II's reign, including his conflicts with baronial opponents and his reliance on favourites who exercised power without possessing the military capabilities or political judgment necessary for effective government, culminated in the king's deposition in January of 1327 and his subsequent murder while in custody. The accession of Edward III in 1327 initiated a reign that would see the revival of English military fortunes through tactical innovations that revolutionized the role of knights in warfare, while creating a new model of chivalric culture that emphasized both martial prowess and courtly refinement. The early years of Edward's reign, during which his mother Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer exercised actual power, saw continued military failures in Scotland, including the humiliating Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, which recognised Scottish independence on terms favourable to the Scots. Edward's assumption of personal rule in 1330 through the arrest and execution of Mortimer enabled him to pursue independent policies that would transform both English military practice and the cultural expression of knighthood. The claim to the French throne that Edward advanced in 1337, based on his descent through his mother Isabella from the French royal line, provided the justification for what would become the 100 Years' War, a prolonged conflict that dominated English military and political life throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The military innovations that characterized English warfare during Edward's French campaigns reflected lessons learned from the Scottish wars, particularly the effectiveness of defensive infantry formations supported by archery in defeating cavalry attacks. The tactical system that emerged combined dismounted men-at-arms, who would fight on foot to provide a stable defensive corps, with large numbers of longbowmen positioned on the flanks where they could shoot into attacking enemy forces while being protected by the men-at-arms against cavalry charges. This combined arms approach required knights to abandon the mounted charges that had defined their military role for centuries, instead fighting as heavily armoured infantry who used their superior equipment and training to hold defensive positions while archers broke enemy attacks. The Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346, provided the first major demonstration of the effectiveness of these new tactics, as Edward's army of approximately 10,000 to 15,000 men, deployed on a slope with archers on both flanks and dismounted men-at-arms in the centre, repeatedly defeated French cavalry charges by numerically superior forces. The French tactical approach, which relied on repeated cavalry charges by mounted knights seeking to overwhelm the English position through sheer force, proved completely ineffective against the combination of longbow fire that disrupted formations and killed or wounded horses, and the solid defensive line of dismounted men-at-arms who could not be broken by the disorganized cavalry that reached their positions. The scale of the French defeat, which saw thousands of French knights killed, including King John of Bohemia, who fought despite being blind, while English casualties remained relatively light, demonstrated the revolution in military tactics that English commanders had achieved. The siege of Calais that followed the victory at Crécy, lasting from September 1346 to August 1347, demonstrated Edward's strategic understanding of the importance of securing a permanent base in France that could support future military operations and facilitate trade, while providing a secure port for English forces. The chivalric culture that flourished during Edward's reign, exemplified by the founding of the Order of the Garter in approximately 1348, represented a deliberate attempt to revive and celebrate knightly ideals while creating institutional structures that bound the most important nobles and knights to the crown through membership in an elite chivalric order. The Order of the Garter, limited to the king and 25 knight companions, established a model of chivalric brotherhood that emphasized personal loyalty to the sovereign, mutual support among members, and the cultivation of martial prowess tempered by Christian virtue and courtly refinement. The elaborate ceremonies and distinctive regalia associated with the order, including the blue garter worn on the leg and the chapel at Windsor Castle, where installation ceremonies took place, created powerful symbols of knightly elite status, while providing Edward with an instrument for rewarding and controlling his most important military commanders. The continuation of English military success in France during the 1350s, including the victory of Edward's son, the Black Prince, at the Battle of Poitiers on September 19, 1356, where another English army using similar tactics defeated and captured King John II of France, established the effectiveness of English military methods and enabled territorial gains, formalized in the Treaty of Bretagne of 1360. The Battle of Poitiers demonstrated the adaptability of English tactics to different terrain conditions, as the Black Prince positioned his forces on a slope, protected by hedges and marshland, that channeled French attacks into kill zones where archery could be most effective. The capture of the French king at Poitiers, achieved when the final French cavalry charge broke through to the English position, only to find themselves outnumbered and surrounded by English reserves that had been held back for exactly this possibility, represented both a tactical triumph and a windfall in ransom value that enriched the English crown and the knights who participated in the capture. The transformation of the knights' military role during this period, from mounted shock combat to service as heavily armoured infantry in combined arms formations, occurred alongside significant changes in armour technology that reflected both the changing tactical environment and advances in metalworking capabilities. The transition from mail to plate armour accelerated during the mid-14th century as armourers developed techniques for shaping steel plates that could deflect arrows and sword strikes more effectively than mail, while distributing affronten weight more efficiently across the body. The development of complete plate armour suits during the second half of the 14th century created protection that covered the entire body with articulated steel plates, transforming knights into walking fortresses whose armour could resist most weapons while maintaining sufficient mobility for combat on foot. The increased weight of full plate armour, typically 45 to 55 pounds for a complete suit, required careful distribution across the entire body to remain practical for sustained combat, though the popular image of knights unable to move without assistance represented a significant exaggeration based on later ceremonial armours rather than functional combat equipment. The social implications of the increasingly expensive equipment required for knightly service created growing distinctions between wealthy knights who could afford the latest armour technology and less prosperous members of the knightly class who struggled to maintain themselves in appropriate military readiness. The economic pressures affecting the knightly class during the later 14th century, including the demographic catastrophe of the Black Death and the subsequent agricultural labour shortage that undermined traditional seigneurial revenues, created financial stresses that made the expenses of knighthood increasingly difficult to sustain for all but the wealthiest landholders. The Black Death's arrival in England during the summer of 1348, spreading from ports in the southwest to eventually kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population over the following 2 years, transformed English society and economy in ways that significantly affected the knightly class. The dramatic reduction in population created severe labour shortages that enabled surviving peasants to demand higher wages and better conditions, undermining the economic foundations of knightly estates that had depended on abundant cheap labour and customary obligations. The attempts by Parliament to maintain pre-plague wage levels through legislation like the Statute of Labourers of 1351 proved largely ineffective against market forces, while the erosion of customary labour services as peasants fled estates where lords attempted to enforce traditional obligations created widespread social unrest that would eventually explode in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The military implications of the demographic catastrophe included reduced availability of manpower for military campaigns, though the continued effectiveness of English armies in France during the 1350s suggested that quality and tactical sophistication could compensate for reduced numbers. The resumption of the Hundred Years' War during the 1369 to 1375 period, under less capable English military leadership than had characterized the campaigns of the 1340s and 1350s, saw the gradual erosion of English territorial gains as French forces avoided pitched battles and instead conducted systematic campaigns to recapture English-held territories through sieges and raids. The death of Edward III in 1377 and the accession of his grandson Richard II, still a child, created political instability that combined with military reverses in France and domestic social tensions to produce a crisis that severely tested English political and social structures. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, triggered by the imposition of poll taxes and fueled by decades of accumulated grievances over economic exploitation and social inequality, demonstrated both the fragility of social order and the military capabilities of aroused common people when organized for collective action. The rebels' success in capturing London and executing several royal officials, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, who also served as Chancellor, before the young King Richard met with rebel leaders and made promises that temporarily dispersed the uprising, revealed the limitations of knightly military power when confronting urban mobs and organized bands of commoners fighting on favorable terrain. The brutal suppression of the revolt that followed Richard's escape from London saw knights and men-at-arms conduct systematic reprisals against communities that had participated in the uprising, executing hundreds of rebels and reasserting aristocratic military dominance through terror and exemplary violence. The later years of Richard's reign saw growing conflicts between the king and powerful noble factions, culminating in Richard's deposition in 1399 by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who seized the throne as Henry IV and initiated the Lancastrian dynasty that would rule England until 1461. The military challenges facing the Lancastrian kings, including renewed warfare with France, persistent rebellions by disaffected nobles, and chronic conflicts with Scotland, required the maintenance of substantial military forces, while the Crown's limited financial resources created constant tensions with Parliament over taxation to support military operations. The revival of English military fortunes in France during the reign of Henry V, who succeeded his father in March of 1413, demonstrated both the continuing effectiveness of English tactical methods and the exceptional military leadership that Henry provided through his strategic vision and his ability to inspire loyalty and courage in his troops. The Agincourt campaign of 1415, undertaken by Henry with an army of approximately 9,000 men to assert his claims to French territories, achieved its decisive success at the Battle of Agincourt on October 25, 1415, where English forces using the tactical system developed during the previous century defeated a French army that outnumbered them by perhaps 3 or 4 to 1. The Battle of Agincourt saw English forces, consisting of approximately 1,000 men-at-arms and 6,000 archers plus supporting troops, position themselves across the French line of advance in a recently ploughed field between two woods. With archers on both flanks, protected by sharpened stakes, driven into the ground to deter cavalry charges. The French tactical approach, which again relied on cavalry charges and advances by dismounted men-at-arms in heavy armor, proved disastrously ineffective as the muddy field conditions that resulted from recent rains exhausted armored French knights who had to advance hundreds of yards under constant arrow fire before reaching English positions. The decisive phase of the battle saw French forces become so densely packed in the narrow space between the woods that they could barely use their weapons effectively, while English men-at-arms and archers engaged in close combat against exhausted and immobilized opponents who fell in heaps that created obstacles impeding further French attacks. The scale of French casualties at Agincourt, including thousands of knights and nobles killed while English losses remained relatively light, represented another catastrophic defeat for French chivalry that established Henry's reputation as one of the great military commanders of the age. The systematic conquest of Normandy that Henry conducted between 1417 and 1419 demonstrated his strategic capabilities and his understanding that permanent territorial control required not just battlefield victories, but also the capture of fortified positions and the establishment of effective administrative control over conquered territories. the Treaty of Troyes in May of 1420, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and regent of France during the lifetime of the mentally unstable French king Charles VI, represented the culmination of English military success and appeared to promise the eventual union of England and France under Lancastrian rule. Henry's death from dysentery in August of 1422, occurring while he was campaigning in France and just 2 months before the death of Charles VI, transformed the political situation by leaving the English claim in the hands of Henry's infant son, Henry VI, whose weak rule would eventually see the loss of all English possessions in France except Calais. The gradual erosion of English positions in France during the 1430s and 1440s, accelerated by the emergence of Joan of Arc as a French military leader, whose victories broke the pattern of English tactical superiority, demonstrated that the military methods that had proven so effective during the 14th century could be countered by commanders who avoided direct confrontations and instead focused on relieving besieged cities and conducting campaigns that forced English armies to give battle under disadvantageous conditions. The final phase of the 100 Years' War saw English forces suffer a series of devastating defeats, including the Battle of Formigny in April of 1450 and the Battle of Castillon in July of 1453, which employed artillery bombardment to destroy English defensive positions before attacking with combined forces that overwhelmed the surviving defenders. The loss of Bordeaux in October of 1453 marked the effective end of English control in France, with only Calais remaining under English rule, bringing to a close more than a century of warfare that had profoundly shaped English military culture and the institution of knighthood. The domestic consequences of the final English defeats in France included the return of large numbers of soldiers with military experience but without employment opportunities, creating social instability that contributed to the outbreak of the Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic civil wars that would devastate the English nobility and fundamentally transform the nature of aristocratic power. The Wars of the Roses, beginning with the First Battle of St. Albans in May of 1455, when Richard, Duke of York's forces ambushed a royal army in the streets of St. Albans, initiated 3 decades of intermittent civil warfare that would see the deposition of kings, the extinction of numerous noble families, and fundamental changes in the relationship between the monarchy and the aristocracy. The military character of Wars of the Roses battles differed significantly from the great Anglo-French engagements of the 100 Years' War, with most encounters involving relatively small forces of armoured men-at-arms and archers fighting on foot, often in confused melees where the advantages of tactical position and numerical superiority proved more decisive than innovative tactics or sophisticated strategy. The Battle of Towton, fought on March 29, 1461, in a snowstorm that hindered visibility and made combat conditions particularly brutal, constituted the largest and bloodiest battle of the wars, with contemporary estimates suggesting that 28,000 men fought and that thousands died during the battle and subsequent pursuit of defeated Lancastrian forces. The scale of casualties among the nobility during the Wars of the Roses exceeded anything England had experienced in previous conflicts, as the intensely personal and political nature of the civil wars meant that defeated nobles often faced execution or attainder rather than the ransoming that had characterized warfare with foreign enemies. The Battle of Barnet on April 14, 1471, fought in fog so dense that formations became disoriented and parts of the Lancastrian army mistakenly attacked each other, demonstrated the confusion and chance that characterized much of Wars of the Roses combat, with the outcome often determined more by mistakes and misfortunes than by superior leadership or tactics. The Battle of Tewkesbury on May 4, 1471, which saw Yorkist forces under Edward IV decisively defeat the Lancastrians and effectively destroy the Lancastrian cause, included the killing of numerous Lancastrian nobles who sought sanctuary in the abbey after the battle, demonstrating the brutality and disregard for traditional protections that characterized the later stages of the conflict. The brief restoration of Edward IV's rule between 1471 and 1483 provided a period of relative stability that enabled the recovery of trade and the reconstruction of royal finances. though Edward's sudden death in April of 1483 initiated a final crisis that would see the Yorkist dynasty collapse and a new royal house emerge. The usurpation of the throne by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who seized power as Richard III after declaring his nephews illegitimate and subsequently causing their disappearance from the Tower of London, created political conditions that enabled Henry Tudor's invasion in 1485 despite his extremely tenuous claim to the throne. The Battle of Bosworth Field, on August 22, 1485, which saw Richard killed and Henry Tudor proclaimed king as Henry VII, is traditionally regarded as marking the end of the Middle Ages in England and the beginning of the Tudor period, though the transition involved gradual changes rather than immediate transformations. The impact of the Wars of the Roses on the English nobility and the institution of knighthood proved profound and lasting, as the systematic elimination of numerous noble families through battlefield deaths and political executions, combined with the attainders that confiscated estates and titles, fundamentally reduced the power of the traditional aristocracy. Henry VII's approach to governance emphasized the restoration of royal authority at the expense of noble power, utilizing bureaucratic administration rather than relying on great nobles for military and political support. While his careful management of royal finances and his avoidance of expensive foreign wars enabled him to strengthen the crown's position without requiring the taxation that might provoke baronial opposition. The transformation of knighthood during the Tudor period saw the continued decline of its military significance, as changes in warfare increasingly emphasized firearms and professional infantry forces over armored cavalry, while knighthood itself became primarily a social honor bestowed by the monarch rather than a functional military role. The development of effective firearms during the 15th century, particularly the arquebus and later the musket, created weapons that could penetrate armor and required far less training than the longbow, while being usable by common soldiers without the years of practice necessary for effective archery. The changing tactical environment of the early 16th century, characterized by the dominance of pike and shot infantry formations that combined dense masses of pikemen with firearms-equipped soldiers who could disrupt enemy formations before pike combat began, left little effective role for heavily armored cavalry, whose charges could be stopped by pike walls, and whose armor proved increasingly vulnerable to firearms. The knightly class's response to these military changes involved either adaptation to new forms of military service, including serving as officers, commanding pike and shot formations, or as heavy cavalry, employing pistols rather than lances, or a retreat from active military roles into positions emphasizing administrative service, courtly duties, and the management of estates. The reign of Henry VIII, beginning in April of 1509, with the accession of a young king who cultivated an image of martial prowess and chivalric virtue, saw a brief revival of traditional chivalric culture and tournament activities, though these increasingly served ceremonial and diplomatic functions rather than providing genuine military training. Henry's early wars with France and Scotland, including his invasion of France in 1513 and the victory of English forces at the Battle of Flodden Field in September of 1513, demonstrated that traditional military methods could still achieve successes against opponents employing similar tactics, though the changing nature of European warfare was already making these approaches obsolete. The Field of Cloth of Gold in June of 1520, an elaborate diplomatic meeting between Henry and Francis I of France, held near Calais, featured extensive tournaments and displays of chivalric culture that served primarily as diplomatic theatre and demonstrations of royal magnificence, rather than as serious military exercises. The dissolution of the monasteries during the 1530s, which saw Henry seize the lands and wealth of England's religious houses as part of his break with Rome, created opportunities for the king to reward supporters with grants of former monastic estates, enabling a reconstitution of the landed gentry through the enrichment of families who owed their positions directly to royal favour rather than ancient feudal relationships. The military challenges of Henry's later reign, including renewed wars with France and Scotland, and the need to defend against potential invasion following his excommunication by the Pope, required the creation of new military organizations, including an expanded navy and coastal fortifications, while the dissolution of traditional feudal military obligations necessitated new systems for recruiting and maintaining military forces. The development of the Tudor militia system, which required counties to maintain trained bands of infantry armed with pikes and firearms under the command of local gentry who served as officers, created a new military role for knights and gentlemen that emphasized leadership and administration rather than personal combat prowess. The reigns of Henry's children, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, saw the continued transformation of knighthood from a military class into a social order defined primarily by gentle birth and royal recognition, with military service becoming just one among many activities appropriate to gentlemen rather than the defining characteristic of knightly status. The expansion of English military commitments during Elizabeth's reign, including support for Protestant forces in the Netherlands, naval warfare against Spain culminating in the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, and campaigns in Ireland, required military forces organized according to early modern principles that bore little resemblance to medieval feudal armies. The role of knights and gentlemen in Elizabethan military forces primarily involved service as officers commanding infantry and cavalry units composed of common soldiers recruited through various means, including voluntary enlistment, impressment, and the mobilization of trained bands, rather than the personal military service of armored warriors that had characterized medieval knighthood. The elaborate system of honors and titles that developed during the Tudor and early Stuart periods included knighthood as one element in a hierarchy of dignities that ranged from simple knights through baronets, barons, viscounts, and earls to marquesses and dukes, with each rank conferring specific social precedents and privileges. The inflation of honors during the reign of James I, who succeeded Elizabeth in 1603 and created numerous new knights and peerages, both to reward supporters and to raise money through the sale of titles, significantly devalued knighthood as a distinctive honor and contributed to its transformation into a relatively common dignity bestowed for various services rather than a mark of elite military status. The creation of the hereditary title of baronet in 1611, positioned between knights and barons in the social hierarchy and explicitly created as a revenue-raising mechanism, with the title being sold to wealthy gentlemen, demonstrated how completely the connection between military service and honorific titles had dissolved by the early 17th century. The English Civil War of the 1640s, which pitted royalist forces supporting King Charles I against parliamentary armies, saw knights and gentlemen divided between the two sides, based on political and religious convictions, rather than shared class interests, demonstrating that knighthood no longer created unified political or military allegiances among its members. The military organization of both royalist and parliamentary forces during the Civil War reflected contemporary European practices, with infantry regiments armed with pikes and muskets forming the core of armies, while cavalry units employed firearms as well as swords and operated using tactics derived from continental models rather than medieval English. Traditions. The new model army, created by Parliament in 1645 to provide a professional military force organized and equipped according to modern principles, commanded by officers promoted based on ability rather than social rank, represented the complete replacement of feudal military organization with early modern standing armies. The execution of Charles I in January of 1649 and the brief republican experiment under the Commonwealth and Protectorate saw some traditional aristocratic privileges questioned, though the fundamental social hierarchy remained largely intact, and the restoration of Charles II in 1660 re-established traditional patterns of aristocratic dominance. The Restoration period and the reigns of the later Stuart and early Hanoverian monarchs saw knighthood firmly established as a social honor bearing no necessary connection to military service, bestowed by the monarch for various achievements, including government service, commercial success, artistic or scientific accomplishment, and simple social prominence. The creation of new orders of knighthood during the 18th and 19th centuries, including the Order of the Bath, revived in 1725, the Order of St. Michael and St. George, established in 1818, and the Order of the British Empire, created in 1917, provided mechanisms for recognizing various forms of service to the state while maintaining the medieval terminology and some of the ceremonial traditions of chivalric orders. The Victorian revival of interest in medieval chivalry, stimulated by Romantic literature and the Gothic revival in architecture, created an idealized image of medieval knighthood that emphasized courtesy, honor, and the protection of the weak, while largely ignoring the violent realities of medieval warfare and the often brutal behavior of historical knights. This romanticized vision of chivalry influenced Victorian concepts of gentlemanly behavior and contributed to the development of muscular Christianity and other ideologies that sought to adapt medieval values to modern circumstances. Though the connection to historical realities remained tenuous at best, the transformation of knighthood into its modern form, as primarily an honorific title bestowed for various achievements, retaining medieval terminology and ceremonial elements, while bearing no connection to military service or feudal obligations, represents the culmination of centuries of gradual evolution from the institution's origins in the military necessities of the Norman Conquest and the feudal organization of medieval society. The experience of the First World War between 1914 and 1918 profoundly affected the British honours system and the institution of knighthood, as the unprecedented scale of military mobilization and the devastating casualties suffered by all social classes created pressures to expand recognition of service beyond the traditional aristocratic recipients of honours. The carnage of trench warfare on the Western Front, which saw hundreds of thousands of British soldiers killed in offensives that gained minimal territorial advantages while requiring levels of courage and endurance that exceeded anything demanded in previous conflicts, demonstrated that valor and sacrifice were no longer the exclusive preserve of the officer class, drawn from knightly and aristocratic families. The establishment of military decorations like the Military Cross and the Distinguished Service Order, which could be awarded to officers for gallantry in action, provided recognition for battlefield courage that complemented, rather than replaced, the traditional honours system, while the creation of decorations available to enlisted men acknowledged the contributions of common soldiers whose social origins would have precluded recognition under earlier arrangements. The expansion of the Order of the British Empire during and immediately after the war, with the creation of multiple classes of membership ranging from Knights Grand Cross down to members of the Order, enabled the recognition of thousands of individuals whose contributions to the war effort included not only military service, but also industrial production, medical care, administrative functions, and various forms of civilian support essential to modern total warfare. The social composition of those receiving knighthoods expanded significantly during this period to include industrialists whose factories produced munitions and other war materials, scientists whose research contributed to military technology, medical professionals who treated the wounded, and senior civil servants who managed the vast administrative apparatus necessary for mobilizing national resources. The participation of knights and members of the aristocracy in the war as junior officers, leading infantry platoons and commanding companies, resulted in casualty rates among these social groups that equaled or exceeded those suffered by common soldiers, as the obligation to lead from the front and to set examples of courage for their men exposed officers to concentrated fire from machine guns and artillery that made battlefield survival largely a matter of chance, regardless of social rank. The death of approximately 20% of British peers and sons of peers who served in combat positions during the war represented an extraordinary demographic catastrophe for the aristocracy, fundamentally altering the composition of the nobility while demonstrating through the most terrible proof possible that hereditary privilege no longer conferred exemption from the risks of modern warfare. The participation of women in war work during the conflict, including their service as nurses, their employment in munitions factories, and their assumption of various civilian roles previously reserved for men, created precedents for the recognition of female achievement through the honours system. Though the creation of specifically female divisions of orders like the Order of the British Empire reflected continuing assumptions about appropriate gender distinctions, even as women's contributions challenged traditional limitations. The immediate post-war period saw a substantial expansion in the number of knighthoods conferred, partly reflecting genuine recognition of wartime service, but also influenced by the Lloyd George government's controversial practice of effectively selling honours to raise funds for political purposes, creating a scandal that prompted reforms designed to restore integrity to the honours system. The Honours Prevention of Abuses Act of 1925, passed in response to revelations about the systematic sale of titles and honours, made it a criminal offence to offer to procure or accept payment for the grant of a dignity or title, establishing legal constraints that sought to preserve the honours system's credibility while acknowledging that its corruption during the immediate post-war years had significantly damaged public confidence. The expansion of the British Empire to its maximum territorial extent during the immediate post-war period, including the acquisition of former German colonies in Africa and former Ottoman territories in the Middle East, administered under League of Nations mandates, created additional demands for the recognition of imperial administrators, military commanders, and others whose service in colonial territories had previously received less systematic acknowledgement. The development of the Order of the British Empire, specifically as an honour that could recognise service throughout the empire, with appointments recommended by colonial governors and high commissioners, as well as by metropolitan departments, established institutional mechanisms that facilitated the broader distribution of honours while maintaining hierarchical distinctions that reflected prevailing assumptions about racial and social categories. The interwar period saw the gradual consolidation of knighthood's transformation into a recognition of professional achievement and public service across an increasingly diverse range of fields, with knights including not only military officers and civil servants, but also scientists, artists, businessmen, labour leaders, and sports figures whose accomplishments brought credit to the nation. The expansion of higher education during the early 20th century and the increasing professionalization of various occupations created new categories of achievement that the honours system recognized through knighthoods. As university administrators, prominent academics, leading physicians, and senior judges received recognition for contributions to their fields that previous generations would not have considered appropriate grounds for such honours. The development of the British Broadcasting Corporation during the 1920s and its rapid emergence as a central institution of British cultural life created a new arena of public service that the honours system acknowledged through the knighting of senior BBC executives and prominent broadcasters whose work shaped national discourse and contributed to British cultural prestige. The political tensions of the 1930s, including the economic dislocations of the Great Depression, the rise of fascism in Europe, and the growing threat of renewed continental warfare, affected the honours system through debates about whether recognition should be extended to those whose political activities challenged established institutions or advocated controversial positions, generally resulting in the exclusion of political radicals from honours, regardless of their actual contributions or achievements. The outbreak of the Second World War in September of 1939 initiated another period of total warfare that would again test British society and transform many institutions, including the honours system, which adapted to recognise the contributions of an even broader spectrum of participants in the war effort than had been acknowledged during the previous conflict. The experience of the Second World War differed from that of the First in ways that significantly affected patterns of honour distribution, including the greater emphasis on scientific and technical contributions to warfare, the central importance of industrial production and resource management, the significance of intelligence operations and code breaking, and the substantial role of civilian populations who endured bombing campaigns and contributed to civil defense efforts. The development of radar technology, the breaking of German codes at Bletchley Park, the organization of convoy systems that maintained vital supply lines across the Atlantic, and the coordination of the vast industrial mobilization necessary to produce weapons, aircraft, and other military equipment all represented achievements that received recognition through honours, including knighthoods for the scientists, administrators, and military leaders responsible for these crucial contributions. The post-war Labour government, elected in July of 1945, committed to creating a welfare state and reducing social inequalities through redistribution and expanded public services, approached the honours system with some ambivalence given its association with hereditary privilege and class distinctions that Labour's ideology opposed, yet ultimately maintained and even expanded the system, while attempting to ensure that recognition extended more democratically across society. The decolonisation process that accelerated dramatically after 1945, seeing the independence of India and Pakistan in 1947, followed by the gradual dissolution of British colonial rule throughout Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean over subsequent decades, fundamentally altered the context within which honours were granted to colonial administrators and military officers, as the assumption that imperial service represented a positive contribution worthy of recognition became increasingly contested. The independence of former colonies transformed many of the individuals who had received honours for colonial service into representatives of a discredited imperial project, while creating awkward situations where those who had fought against British rule might be offered honours by the same system that had previously recognised those who attempted to suppress independence movements. The establishment of independent honours systems by former colonies, many of which created their own orders of knighthood and other dignities, modelled partly on British precedents, but adapted to reflect national values and priorities, represented both a continuation of traditions established during the imperial period and an assertion of sovereignty through the power to grant recognition and confer status. The social transformations of the 1950s and 1960s, including rising living standards, expanded educational opportunities, the emergence of youth culture and popular entertainment as significant cultural forces, and the gradual erosion of traditional deference to established hierarchies, created pressures on the honours system to expand recognition beyond traditional categories and to acknowledge achievements in fields like popular music, professional sports, and mass entertainment that previous generations would have considered insufficiently dignified for such recognition. The Beatles' receipt of MBE medals in 1965, though not knighthoods, generated controversy that reflected tensions between traditional conceptions of honours as recognising service to state and empire, and emerging views that honours should acknowledge cultural achievement and popular success, regardless of whether such accomplishments aligned with establishment values. The development of the modern economy during the post-war period, characterised by the growth of service industries, the expansion of finance and banking, the emergence of technology companies, and increasing economic globalization, created new categories of business achievement that the honours system recognised through knighthoods for successful entrepreneurs, financiers, and corporate executives whose wealth creation was deemed to serve national interests. The growing importance of the City of London as a global financial centre and the associated expansion of banking, insurance, and financial services created a substantial constituency for honours among senior executives in these industries, leading to regular knighthoods for bank chairmen, insurance company directors, and others whose contributions to British economic performance were evaluated primarily through their success in generating profits and maintaining London's position in international finance. The emergence of the National Health Service as one of Britain's most valued institutions created opportunities for recognising medical professionals whose contributions to public health extended beyond individual clinical practice, with knighthoods granted to hospital administrators, medical researchers, public health officials, and pioneering surgeons whose innovations advanced medical capabilities. The expansion of higher education during the 1960s and subsequent decades, including the creation of numerous new universities and the substantial growth in student numbers, led to regular knighthoods for university vice-chancellors and prominent academics whose leadership of educational institutions or whose scholarly achievements in various fields brought credit to British intellectual life. The development of professional sports into major commercial enterprises, generating substantial revenues and commanding enormous public attention, created debates about whether athletic achievement warranted recognition through the honours system, generally resolved in favour of granting honours to successful athletes, particularly when their achievements brought international prestige to Britain through Olympic medals, World Cup victories, or other high-profile successes. The technological transformations of the late 20th century, including the development of computing, telecommunications, biotechnology, and various other fields that reshaped economic and social life, led to honors for computer scientists, engineers, and technology entrepreneurs whose innovations contributed to British technological capabilities, or whose companies achieved commercial success in emerging industries. The increasing prominence of charitable and non-profit organizations in providing social services, conducting scientific research, raising funds for various causes, and advocating for policy changes created additional categories for recognition through honors, with knighthoods granted to leaders of major charities, heads of non-profit research organizations, and individuals whose fundraising or advocacy achieved significant impact. The evolution of British society toward greater multiculturalism during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, reflecting immigration from former colonies, the European Union, and other regions, gradually influenced the demographic composition of those receiving honors, though the representation of ethnic minorities among recipients of knighthoods and other senior honors remained substantially below their proportion of the population. The question of whether the honors system adequately recognized the contributions of women generated ongoing controversy, as statistical analyses consistently demonstrated that women received fewer honors overall, and particularly fewer senior honors like knighthoods, compared to men, prompting periodic initiatives to address the imbalance, while structural factors including occupational segregation and different career patterns continued to affect the pool of candidates considered for recognition. The expansion of honors to recognize achievement in popular culture, including the granting of knighthoods to actors, musicians, authors, and other entertainment figures whose work achieved critical acclaim or popular success, reflected both genuine respect for artistic achievement and calculations about maintaining the honors system's relevance to contemporary society by acknowledging forms of excellence that resonated with broad publics. The controversial decision to grant knighthoods to Rolling Stones members Mick Jagger in 2002 and Keith Richards in 2003, representatives of a counterculture that had explicitly challenged establishment values during the 1960s, demonstrated how thoroughly the honors system had evolved from its medieval origins in military service to become a generalized mechanism for recognizing various forms of achievement and celebrity. The role of prime ministers in recommending individuals for honors, particularly the discretionary honors granted for political services, continued to generate controversy when political supporters or major financial donors to political parties received knighthoods, creating perceptions that honors could effectively be purchased through political contributions, despite the legal prohibitions established in the 1920s. The periodic proposals to abolish knighthoods and other honors associated with aristocratic traditions, advanced by those who viewed such distinctions as incompatible with democratic equality and meritocratic principles, generated debates that generally concluded with the retention of existing honors, supplemented by reforms designed to make the system more transparent and responsive to public opinion. The establishment of independent committees to review nominations for honors and to consider appeals from those whose nominations had been rejected represented attempts to reduce political influence over the process, while maintaining ultimate governmental control through ministerial approval of recommendations. The question of whether individuals who had received honors should forfeit them if subsequently convicted of serious crimes, or whose behavior brought dishonor to the system, prompted the development of procedures for annulling honors in exceptional circumstances, though the relative rarity of such forfeitures reflected both the careful vetting of candidates before honors were granted and reluctance to revisit decisions except in cases of egregious misconduct. The relationship between the British honors system and those of other Commonwealth realms evolved as these countries developed their own distinct national identities and honors systems, with some maintaining British honors, including knighthoods, while others created entirely independent systems of recognition that reflected national values and priorities without reference to British precedents. The decision by Australia to cease recommending Australian citizens for substantive British knighthoods in 1983, followed by the brief reintroduction of knighthoods within the Australian honours system between 2014 and 2015 before their final abolition, illustrated ongoing tensions between Republican sentiment and traditional connections to British institutions. The continuation of knighthoods in the British honours system despite periodic controversies and debates about their appropriateness, reflected both genuine public affection for traditional ceremonial occasions and the practical utility of honors as tools for recognizing achievement, encouraging service, and maintaining social hierarchies through mechanisms that commanded broader acceptance than more explicit assertions of privilege. The investiture ceremonies, at which the monarch personally conferred knighthoods and other honors, conducted at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle with elaborate protocol and ceremonial, served important symbolic functions in maintaining connections between the crown and successful individuals across society, while providing occasions that celebrated achievement and affirmed the legitimacy of institutional authority. The role of knighthoods in contemporary British society, bearing no connection whatever to military service or feudal obligations, but serving primarily as recognition of professional achievement, cultural contribution, business success, charitable service, or political activity, represents the final transformation of an institution that originated in the military necessities of medieval conquest into a generalized system of honorific reward, completely divorced from its historical foundations. The survival of medieval terminology and ceremonial forms within this thoroughly modern honors system, including the ritual of being touched on the shoulder with a sword during investiture, and the use of titles like knight and dame that deliberately evoke chivalric traditions, demonstrates the enduring power of historical symbolism, even when the institutions those symbols represent have been completely transformed in function and meaning. The contemporary debates about the future of the honors system, including proposals to eliminate or substantially reform knighthoods, to establish more stringent criteria for recognition, to ensure greater diversity in recipients, and to reduce political influence over the selection process, reflect continuing tensions between traditional forms and contemporary values, while acknowledging that systems of recognition and reward serve important social functions, regardless of their specific institutional arrangements. The persistence of significant public interest in honors, demonstrated by media coverage of honors lists, public discussions of whether particular individuals deserve recognition, and the evident pride that recipients and their families take in receiving honors, suggests that the desire for formal recognition of achievement represents a fundamental human motivation that any society must acknowledge through some institutional mechanism, even if the specific forms such recognition takes vary across cultures and change over time. The question of whether knighthoods and other honors effectively serve their intended purposes of recognizing genuine achievement and encouraging service, or whether they have become primarily mechanisms for rewarding political supporters, celebrating celebrity, and maintaining class distinctions under the guise of meritocratic recognition, generates ongoing controversy that reflects fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between individual achievement and social recognition. The expansion of honors to encompass an increasingly diverse range of achievements and recipients, from medieval mounted warriors serving 40 days annually in exchange for land tenure, to contemporary scientists, artists, business executives, charity workers, civil servants, and entertainers recognized for contributions that often have no direct connection to service to the state, demonstrates both the adaptability of traditional institutions and the extent to which their survival depends on continuous evolution in response to changing social conditions and values. The role of knighthoods within the broader structure of British honours, which includes multiple orders with various ranks, single decorations for specific types of service, and life peerages that confer membership in the House of Lords, creates a complex system of distinctions that reflects assumptions about appropriate hierarchies of achievement and the differential value of various forms of contribution to society. The question of whether knighthoods retain sufficient prestige to motivate individuals to excel in their fields, or to undertake service they might otherwise avoid, one of the practical justifications offered for maintaining the honours system, depends partly on the selectivity with which honours are granted, and partly on broader cultural attitudes toward traditional institutions and established hierarchies. The international dimension of British honours, including the practice of granting honorary knighthoods to citizens of other countries whose achievements or service benefited Britain, or strengthened bilateral relationships, creates opportunities for diplomatic recognition while raising questions about the appropriateness of a British honour for individuals who have no connection to British society beyond specific achievements or relationships. The decision to grant an honorary knighthood to Bill Gates in 2005 for his contributions to reducing global poverty through the Gates Foundation, representing recognition of philanthropic activity entirely unconnected to Britain, illustrated the extent to which honours had evolved from recognition of service to the British state to acknowledgement of achievement that aligned with British values or interests. The debates about whether individuals with controversial political views or whose business practices generated criticism should receive honours, including cases where nominations were rejected following public controversy or where honours were granted despite significant opposition, demonstrate the challenges of maintaining an honours system in democratic societies where diverse opinions about merit and appropriate recognition ensure that almost any selection will generate some disagreement. The relationship between knighthoods and other forms of social recognition, including professional certifications, academic degrees, industry awards, and popular acclaim, raises questions about what distinctive function honours serve and whether their survival depends primarily on their historical associations and ceremonial distinctiveness, rather than on any unique capability to identify and reward genuine achievement. The sociological function of honours systems in general, and knighthoods in particular, as mechanisms for managing status competition within complex societies, providing formal recognition that channels ambitions toward achievements deemed socially valuable, while offering consolation prizes for those who have not achieved the highest positions of wealth or power, suggests explanations for their persistence that extend beyond the specific justifications offered in particular cases. The extent to which individuals pursue achievement, partly in hope of receiving honours, or alternatively whether honours primarily recognise accomplishments that would have occurred regardless of any expectation of official recognition, remains an open question that bears directly on debates about whether honours systems actually serve their ostensible purposes of encouraging service and achievement. The comparison between British knighthoods and honours systems in other countries, ranging from French distinctions, like the Legion of Honour, to American presidential medals, to various orders created by European monarchies and republics, reveals both universal tendencies toward formal recognition of achievement and significant variations in the specific forms such recognition takes, reflecting different political traditions, historical experiences, and cultural values. The relative absence of honours systems in some societies, particularly the United States, where the Constitution's prohibition on titles of nobility prevented the development of British-style honours, despite the creation of various presidential awards and military decorations, demonstrates that formal recognition through honorific titles is not essential for social functioning, even if its presence serves particular purposes in societies that maintain such systems. The future trajectory of British knighthoods remains uncertain, depending partly on broader political developments including potential constitutional reforms, changing attitudes toward traditional institutions and class hierarchies, and the ability of the honours system to adapt to emerging values and social structures, while maintaining sufficient continuity to preserve its distinctive character and cultural resonance. The possibility that knighthoods might eventually be abolished or substantially reformed, transforming or replacing them with honours that make no reference to feudal traditions and medieval military service, seems less likely given their resilience through previous periods of social transformation, though the specific criteria for recognition and the demographic composition of recipients will almost certainly continue evolving in response to social changes. The enduring appeal of knighthood as a concept, evidenced by its ubiquitous presence in fantasy literature, popular entertainment, video games, and various forms of cultural production that evoke medieval imagery and chivalric ideals, demonstrates the continuing power of historical symbolism, even when divorced from any connection to contemporary social institutions or actual historical practices. The tension between the romanticized medieval knight of popular imagination, characterized by courage, honor, devotion to ladies, and adherence to chivalric codes, and the historical reality of mounted warriors whose military effectiveness depended on equipment, training, and tactical organization, rather than on adherence to idealized moral codes, illustrates the complex relationship between historical institutions and the cultural meanings subsequently attached to them. The process by which knighthood evolved from a functional military role essential to Norman conquest and the maintenance of feudal authority, through centuries of gradual transformation, as changes in warfare reduced the military significance of heavy cavalry, to emerge as a purely honorific dignity, recognizing achievement across diverse fields, represents a remarkable instance of institutional adaptation and survival through fundamental changes in function and meaning. The preservation of medieval terminology, ceremonial forms, and symbolic associations within a thoroughly modern honors system demonstrates both the power of tradition and the flexibility of traditional forms, when their specific content can be altered to accommodate changing social needs and values. The institution of knighthood in its contemporary form, bearing the name and some of the outward forms of its medieval predecessor, while serving completely different purposes and recognizing completely different types of achievement, provides a striking example of how traditional institutions survive by continually redefining themselves to remain relevant to successive generations, while maintaining sufficient continuity to preserve their distinctive identity, cultural authority. The historiographical debates surrounding knighthood and its evolution reflect broader methodological and interpretative controversies within medieval and military history, with scholars divided over fundamental questions about the origins of knightly institutions, the relationship between military function and social status, the extent to which chivalric ideology actually influenced behavior, and the mechanisms through which an initially functional military role transformed into an honorific dignity. The interpretation of knighthood as primarily a military institution created by practical necessities of feudal warfare dominated historical scholarship during the 19th and early 20th centuries, with historians emphasizing the tactical effectiveness of heavy cavalry and the economic and organizational structures necessary to maintain mounted warriors as explanations for the emergence and persistence of knightly class. This military functional approach, associated particularly with scholars working within German and French traditions of institutional history, understood knighthood as a rational adaptation to medieval conditions of warfare and governance, with chivalric ideology representing a cultural superstructure that developed atop more fundamental material and organizational foundations. The reaction against purely functional interpretations during the mid-20th century led scholars to emphasize the cultural and ideological dimensions of knighthood, arguing that chivalric values and religious ideals shaped the institution as significantly as military necessities, with the knight's self-conception and the broader society's expectations about appropriate conduct exerting real influence on behavior, rather than representing mere rationalizations for class privilege. This cultural ideological approach, influenced by anthropological methods and literary studies, attended closely to chivalric literature, religious texts, and normative sources that articulated ideals of knightly conduct, interpreting these materials as evidence for the values that actually governed aristocratic behavior, rather than dismissing them as propaganda divorced from practice. The tension between these approaches remains unresolved, with scholars continuing to debate whether military function or cultural meaning should receive priority in explanations of knightly institutions, whether material interests or ideological commitments primarily motivated knights, and whether changes in knighthood over time resulted mainly from military technological developments or from cultural religious transformations. The rise of social history methodologies during the 1960s and 1970s directed attention toward questions about the composition of the knightly class, patterns of social mobility into and out of knightly status, the economic foundations of knighthood in agricultural production and lordship over peasant communities, and the mechanisms through which knights maintained their social position across generations, despite the tendency toward partible inheritance to fragment estates. These social historical approaches emphasized quantitative analysis of documentary evidence, including tax records, property transactions, legal proceedings, and administrative documents that revealed patterns of land ownership, wealth distribution, family structures, and social relationships, complementing the earlier focus on narrative sources and normative texts. The attention to material culture and archaeological evidence that accelerated during the late 20th century provided new sources of information about knights' actual equipment, living conditions, castle architecture, and the physical realities of medieval warfare, sometimes confirming and sometimes challenging interpretations derived from documentary sources and often revealing significant gaps between literary representations and lived experience. The analysis of arms and armor through examination of surviving artifacts, supplemented by metallurgical studies and experimental archaeology, has clarified questions about the actual protection provided by various types of defensive equipment, the weight and mobility constraints of different armor configurations, and the techniques of medieval metalworking, while occasionally contradicting assumptions based solely on contemporary descriptions or artistic depictions. The reconstruction of medieval warfare through experimental archaeology, including attempts to recreate authentic armor and weapons, and to test their effectiveness through controlled combat simulations, has provided insights into the physical demands and practical limitations of knightly combat, while demonstrating that literary accounts of battles often simplified or distorted tactical realities. The study of castle architecture and fortification technology through archaeological investigation of castle sites has revealed the actual defensive capabilities of different designs, the evolution of construction techniques, and the material resources required to build and maintain major fortifications, while also uncovering evidence about daily life within castles and the social relationships between castle garrisons and surrounding populations. The feminist historical scholarship that emerged prominently during the 1970s and 1980s challenged traditional narratives of knighthood by asking how this overwhelmingly male institution affected women, how women related to chivalric ideals and knightly culture, whether courtly love literature reflected actual relationships or served other functions, and how the violent masculinity of knightly culture shaped gender relations more broadly in medieval society. These feminist approaches revealed the extent to which traditional knighthood scholarship had assumed male perspectives and male experiences as universal, ignoring or marginalizing women's roles as wives, mothers, patrons, literary audience members, and occasionally as participants in military activities, while the idealization of knights in traditional historiography had often obscured the violence that warriors directed toward women during military campaigns. The recognition that ideals of chivalric behavior toward ladies coexisted with widespread sexual violence during warfare, that courtly love literature flourished in societies where aristocratic women had limited legal rights and were frequently married for political advantage without regard to their preferences, and that knightly masculinity defined itself partly through domination over women and lower status men, complicated romanticized interpretations of chivalric culture while opening new lines of inquiry about the gender politics of medieval aristocratic society. The cultural history approaches that gained prominence during the 1980s and 1990s, influenced by anthropology and literary theory, emphasized the analysis of symbolic systems, ritual practices, and discursive formations through which knighthood was constructed and maintained as a meaningful social category, treating chivalric literature, tournament rituals, heraldic systems, and religious ceremonies as culturally significant practices rather than as mere reflections of material realities. These cultural approaches demonstrated how knighthood functioned as a performative identity that individuals enacted through participation in specific practices and adherence to recognized codes, how the boundary between knights and non-knights was maintained through cultural mechanisms, including heraldry and dubbing ceremonies, rather than through purely functional distinctions, and how chivalric discourse shaped possibilities for thought and action, rather than simply describing pre-existing realities. The emphasis on knights as participants in international cultures that transcended specific kingdoms, evident in the common chivalric literature that circulated across linguistic boundaries, the international character of tournaments and crusades, and the shared aristocratic values that enabled knights from different regions to recognize each other as members of a common status group, challenged nationalist historiographical traditions that had treated English, French, and German knighthood as fundamentally distinct phenomena. The comparative study of knighthood across different regions and time periods has revealed both common patterns and significant variations, with the specific institutional arrangements, cultural expressions, and social significance of knighthood differing substantially between England, France, Germany, Italy, and other European regions, while sharing sufficient common elements to justify treating European knighthood as a unified phenomenon with regional variations. The debate over when knighthood should be considered to have originated reflects both empirical uncertainties about institutional development during periods with limited documentation and theoretical disagreements about what characteristics must be present for knighthood to exist, with some scholars locating origins in Carolingian cavalry reforms of the 8th century, while others argue that recognizable knighthood only emerged during the 11th century, when military function combined with distinctive social status and cultural ideology. The question of whether the Norman Conquest represented a fundamental break in English military and social organization, or whether it primarily accelerated trends already visible in late Anglo-Saxon England, remains contested, with some historians emphasizing the revolutionary character of Norman feudalism and castle building, while others stress continuities in landholding patterns, local administration, and military organization between Anglo-Saxon and Norman periods. The interpretation of how and why knighthood ceased to function primarily as a military institution during the late medieval and early modern periods involves debates about the relative importance of technological changes, particularly development of effective firearms, tactical innovations that reduced the effectiveness of heavy cavalry, economic changes that made maintaining knightly equipment increasingly burdensome, political centralization that created alternative military organizations, and cultural transformations that redefined aristocratic identity to emphasize courtly refinement over martial prowess. The role of printing and changing literacy patterns in transforming chivalric culture during the 15th and 16th centuries deserves consideration, as the mass production of chivalric romances and courtesy books made these materials accessible to broader audiences, while potentially democratizing access to cultural models previously restricted to aristocratic circles. Even as actual knighthood became more clearly defined as an elite status granted by monarchical authority, the relationship between the medieval institution of knighthood and its subsequent cultural afterlife in Romantic literature, Victorian medievalism, and contemporary popular culture raises questions about the mechanisms through which historical phenomena generate persistent symbolic meanings that endure long after the disappearance of the original institutions, with the romanticized knight of modern imagination bearing limited resemblance to medieval realities, while exercising considerable influence on contemporary culture. The construction of chivalric mythology during the 19th century, when industrial society generated nostalgia for imagined medieval communities, organized according to values of honor and loyalty rather than cash and contract, served ideological functions, including legitimizing aristocratic privilege, providing models for bourgeois masculinity, and critiquing the disenchantment and moral emptiness attributed to modern capitalism, while fundamentally distorting medieval realities through selective emphasis and idealization. The 20th century's increasingly skeptical and deconstructive approaches to knighthood, emphasizing the violence and exploitation that characterized actual medieval warfare and aristocratic domination, developed partly in reaction to romantic idealization and partly from broader disillusionment with military valor following the catastrophic world wars that revealed the horrific consequences of modern organized violence. The tension in contemporary scholarship between impulses to demystify knighthood by exposing the material interests and violent practices that romantic accounts obscured, and recognition that medieval people genuinely believed in chivalric ideals that influenced their behavior, even when practice frequently diverged from norms, reflects broader methodological debates about the relationship between ideology and material reality, between cultural meaning and social function. The study of knighthood thus serves as a site where fundamental questions about historical explanation play out, including whether military and economic factors, or cultural and ideological factors, should receive explanatory priority, whether institutions should be understood primarily through their practical functions or through their symbolic meanings, and whether historical actors should be interpreted as rational pursuers of material interests or as believers in values and ideals that transcended immediate self-interest. The remarkable longevity of knighthood as an institution, persisting through enormous changes in military technology, political organization, economic systems, and cultural values, suggests that its survival depended precisely on the flexibility that enabled continuous redefinition of its content while maintaining nominal continuity of form, with each successive generation reinterpreting what knighthood meant to preserve an institution that served varying but persistent social needs for recognition hierarchies and status distinctions. The transformation of knighthood from functional military role to purely honorific dignity represents an extreme case of institutional persistence through complete transformation of content, demonstrating how traditional forms can survive indefinitely by serving entirely new purposes while retaining sufficient symbolic continuity to maintain claims to historical legitimacy and cultural authority. The contemporary institution of knighthood, conferring recognition on scientists, artists, business leaders, and public servants through ceremonies employing medieval symbolism and terminology, exemplifies the complex relationships between history and memory, between institutions and their representations, and between the practical functions that social structures serve and the cultural meanings through which they are understood and legitimized. The continued vitality of scholarly debate about medieval knighthood, centuries after the institution ceased to serve its original military functions, reflects both genuine historical interest in understanding an important aspect of medieval society and recognition that knighthood serves as a particularly rich site for exploring broader questions about how military institutions relate to social structures, how aristocratic cultures develop and function, and how historical institutions transform over time while maintaining nominal continuity. The legacy of medieval knighthood extends far beyond the contemporary honors system to encompass the profound influence of chivalric ideals on subsequent military cultures, notions of gentlemanly conduct, concepts of masculine honor, and romantic imagination, demonstrating how historical institutions can shape cultural possibilities and social practices long after the disappearance of the material conditions that originally generated them. The fact that knighthood remains culturally meaningful and socially significant more than 5 centuries after ceasing to serve military functions testifies to the extraordinary adaptability of human institutions and the remarkable persistence of cultural forms that successfully link historical traditions to contemporary needs and values. The ceremonial dimensions of modern knighthood deserve particular attention as mechanisms through which ancient forms maintain contemporary relevance, with investiture rituals performed by the monarch at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, combining medieval symbolism with carefully choreographed spectacle that transforms what might otherwise be merely bureaucratic recognition into emotionally resonant experiences that participants and observers remember as defining moments in recipients' lives. The physical act of dubbing, wherein the monarch touches the recipient's shoulders with a sword while pronouncing the traditional formula that creates a knight or dame, deliberately evokes medieval ceremonies of knighthood, even though the contemporary ritual bears only superficial resemblance to the complex medieval ceremonies that involved religious vigils, ritual baths, blessing of arms, and elaborate liturgical elements that situated knightly investiture within Christian frameworks of sacred authority and divine approval. The selection of swords for investiture ceremonies itself carries symbolic weight, with various ceremonial blades employed, including some with historical associations to particular monarchs or military campaigns, creating tangible connections between contemporary honors and centuries of accumulated tradition, while the medieval weapon's presence in a modern bureaucratic ritual highlights the paradoxical survival of martial symbolism in honors, now granted primarily for peaceful accomplishments. The spatial setting of investiture ceremonies within royal palaces, whose architecture and decoration celebrate British monarchical history, creates atmospheric contexts that enhance the gravitas of the occasion, with recipients and their families experiencing the bestowal of honors within physical environments saturated with historical associations and artistic representations of previous monarchs, military victories, and moments of national achievement. The dress codes that govern investiture ceremonies, requiring recipients and guests to wear formal attire while specifying that certain other honors previously received should be displayed through the wearing of appropriate decorations and insignia, establish visual hierarchies and social distinctions that reinforce the honors system's function as a mechanism for marking gradations of achievement and status. The presence of family members and guests at investiture ceremonies serves crucial social functions by publicly acknowledging achievements within broader networks of relationships, enabling parents, spouses, children, and friends to witness and participate in recognition that validates not only the recipient's accomplishments, but also the support systems and relationships that enabled those achievements. The media coverage of investiture ceremonies and the publication of honors lists, though criticized by some as promoting celebrity culture and trivializing serious recognition through focus on entertainment figures, actually serves to maintain public engagement with the honors system by making it visible and accessible to broader populations who might otherwise view such distinctions as irrelevant to their lives. The photographs of newly created knights and dames leaving palace investitures, displaying their insignia, become widely circulated images that simultaneously celebrate individual achievement and reinforce the honors system's legitimacy. By demonstrating continued public interest in and respect for these traditional forms of recognition, the timing of honors announcements, particularly the biannual honors lists, published at New Year and on the monarch's official birthday, creates regular ceremonial occasions that punctuate the calendar year while providing opportunities for media coverage and public discussion that maintain the honors system's visibility and cultural salience. The distinction between different honors and their respective insignia, with knights and dames Grand Cross wearing elaborate star decorations and broad sashes, while knights and dames Commander wear smaller badges suspended from neck ribbons and lower ranks display more modest decorations, creates a visual language of hierarchical distinction that enables knowledgeable observers to immediately perceive an individual's position within the honors hierarchy. The heraldic elements incorporated into many orders' insignia, including crosses of various designs, crowns, lions, and other symbols derived from medieval heraldry and royal emblems, deliberately evoke historical continuity, while the specific designs and mottos associated with different orders create distinctive identities that enable recipients to affiliate with particular traditions of service or achievement. The practice of wearing miniature versions of honors insignia on civilian formal wear, permitted and indeed expected at certain official occasions, enables honored individuals to signal their achievements and status in social contexts beyond the immediate ceremony of investiture, functioning as portable markers of official recognition that confer prestige and social capital. The controversy surrounding certain individuals' decisions to decline offered honors or to return previously granted honors in protest against government policies or in response to other controversial honors granted simultaneously, illustrates both the continuing significance attributed to these recognitions and the ways in which the honors system remains embedded in contemporary political and cultural debates. The phenomenon of leaked honors lists prior to official announcements, often revealing controversial selections that generate public criticism before the honors are formally conferred, demonstrates both intense media and public interest in the system and the challenges of maintaining traditional confidentiality norms in contemporary information environments. The establishment of the birthday honors and New Year honors as major media events, with newspapers publishing extensive coverage, analyzing who received what honors and speculating about the reasons for particular selections, reflects the honors system's continuing newsworthiness and its function as a mechanism through which British society recognizes and celebrates various forms of achievement and contribution. The alphabetical listing of honors recipients in official publications, which places knights alongside those receiving lower-ranking honors without hierarchical ordering within each honor category, paradoxically democratizes the announcements by treating all recipients as equally worthy of public acknowledgement, while the accompanying descriptions of achievements provide information that enables readers to understand the diverse contributions being recognized. The international attention to British honours, particularly knighthoods granted to foreign nationals or to British subjects with international profiles, extends the ceremonial system's influence beyond national boundaries, while potentially creating diplomatic complications when controversial figures receive or are denied honors. The use of post-nominal letters to indicate honors received, with knights entitled to use Sir or Dame as honorific prefixes, while members of various orders append letter combinations like GCB, KBE, or CBE after their names, creates a coded language of distinction that those familiar with the honors system can decode to understand an individual's official recognition, while potentially mystifying those unfamiliar with these conventions. The elaborate rules governing how different honors should be worn together, precedents among various orders, and proper forms of address for holders of multiple honors reflect the system's continued attention to hierarchical precision and social protocol. Even as broader society becomes less formally regulated, the survival of distinctly medieval elements within modern honors ceremonies, including not only the dubbing with swords, but also the use of titles like knight and dame that explicitly reference feudal antecedents, demonstrates remarkable institutional conservatism and the enduring appeal of historical forms, even when their original contexts have completely disappeared. The question of whether the ceremonial elements of knighthood genuinely enhance the significance of recognition, or whether they represent anachronistic theatrical performances that distract from the substantive achievements being acknowledged, generates ongoing debate, with defenders arguing that ceremony and tradition add dignity and gravitas, while critics suggest that medieval symbolism seems increasingly incongruous with contemporary meritocratic ideals. The comparison between British investiture ceremonies and honours presentations in republics that have abolished monarchical forms reveals that some degree of ceremonial recognition appears universal across political systems, with even revolutionary regimes that explicitly rejected aristocratic traditions, ultimately creating new honours systems with their own ceremonies and symbols. The psychological impact of ceremonial investiture, which transforms an administrative decision into a personal encounter with the monarch, and a participation in traditions spanning centuries, likely contributes significantly to the honours system's continuing ability to motivate and reward achievement, despite periodic criticisms of its anachronistic elements. The transmission of honours ceremonies through photography and increasingly through video recording creates permanent records of these ephemeral performances, while enabling broader audiences to virtually participate in events physically, attended by only small numbers of people, extending the ceremonial system's reach and reinforcing its social significance through mediated representation. The inclusion of military bands and orchestras in major investiture ceremonies adds auditory dimensions to the visual spectacle, with performances of traditional music including national anthems and ceremonial pieces, creating soundscapes that enhance the emotional resonance of the occasions, while linking contemporary ceremonies to longer traditions of military music and state occasions. The evolution of investiture ceremonies over time, incorporating new honours as they are created, while maintaining core elements like the dubbing ritual for knighthoods, demonstrates the honours system's capacity to adapt ceremonial forms to accommodate changing recognition needs, while preserving sufficient continuity to maintain claims to historical authenticity. The distinction between investiture ceremonies for military and civilian honours, though both now typically conducted by the same monarch in similar settings, acknowledges differing traditions and social contexts of military versus civilian service, while the increasing convergence of ceremonial forms reflects broader social changes that have eroded sharp distinctions between military, civilian spheres. The role of the royal household in organising and conducting investiture ceremonies, involving specialised officials, including the Lord Chamberlain and various aides and assistants who manage the complex logistics of events, at which hundreds of honours may be conferred over several hours, demonstrates the substantial organisational infrastructure necessary to maintain traditional ceremonies at scales appropriate to modern honours distribution. The experience of recipients who describe investiture ceremonies as among the most memorable and meaningful moments of their lives, despite the relatively brief personal interaction with the monarch that characterises these necessarily efficient processing of large numbers of honorees, suggests that ceremonial contexts and symbolic associations can generate profound personal significance, even when specific interactions remain perfunctory. The criticism that investiture ceremonies perpetuate outdated class hierarchies and deferential attitudes toward monarchy, advanced by those who view such rituals as incompatible with democratic equality, encounters the counterargument that ceremonial recognition of achievement through historically resonant forms serves valuable social functions by publicly celebrating excellence and encouraging service, regardless of the specific symbolic vocabulary employed. The question of whether knighthood ceremonies could be substantially reformed or replaced with entirely new forms of recognition without losing their distinctive character and social resonance suggests fundamental tensions between desires for institutional modernization and recognition that successful institutions depend partly on their connections to tradition and their embeddedness in established cultural narratives. The remarkable persistence of ceremonial knighthood through revolutions, political and social, through the democratization of society and the erosion of deference to traditional authorities, through the transformation of Britain from imperial power to post-imperial nation, demonstrates that human societies persistently create and maintain ceremonial forms that mark achievement and confer status, even when the specific symbols and rituals employed may seem disconnected from contemporary social realities. The comparative international perspective on honours systems illuminates the distinctive features of British knighthood, while revealing common patterns in how societies construct mechanisms for recognising achievement and conferring distinction, with virtually all modern nation-states maintaining some form of official recognition system that serves similar social functions despite significant variations in institutional forms and cultural expressions. The French Legion of Honor, established by Napoleon Bonaparte in 1802 and surviving through multiple regime changes, including the restoration of the monarchy, the establishment of republics, and various constitutional transformations, demonstrates how honours systems can transcend specific political arrangements by fulfilling persistent social needs for official recognition of merit and service. The five-class structure of the Legion of Honor, ranging from chevalier through officier, commander, and grand officier to grand croix, creates hierarchical distinctions comparable to those in British orders, while the explicitly republican ideology underlying French honours emphasises merit and achievement rather than aristocratic birth or feudal service, reflecting revolutionary principles that rejected hereditary privilege while maintaining state mechanisms for conferring distinction. The German Federal Cross of Merit, established in 1951 by the Federal Republic of Germany, represents a conscious effort to create an honours system divorced from the militaristic traditions and aristocratic associations of previous German decorations, emphasizing, instead, recognition of contributions to democratic society, international understanding, and social service. Though the persistence of multiple classes, including the Grand Cross Special Class, demonstrates continuing attachment to hierarchical distinctions, the American resistance to establishing a comprehensive honours system comparable to European models reflects constitutional prohibitions on titles of nobility and ideological commitments to republican equality. Yet the proliferation of military decorations, presidential medals, including the Medal of Freedom and the Presidential Medal of Science, and various congressional gold medals demonstrates that even societies explicitly rejecting aristocratic forms create alternative mechanisms for official recognition of achievement. The Japanese Order of Culture and various other honours established during the Meiji Restoration and modified after the 1945 defeat incorporated Western models while adapting them to Japanese cultural contexts, creating distinctive forms that reflected both indigenous traditions of recognizing achievement and the influence of European practices encountered through modernization efforts. The proliferation of honours systems in newly independent nations during the decolonization period of the mid-20th century often involved the creation of indigenous orders that simultaneously asserted national sovereignty through the power to grant recognition and maintained continuities with colonial-era British honours that many elites had received, creating complex relationships between rejection of imperial domination and preservation of familiar institutional forms. The Soviet Union's elaborate system of orders and decorations, including the Order of Lenin, various military decorations, and awards for labor achievements, demonstrated that socialist states explicitly committed to eliminating class distinctions, nevertheless created extensive hierarchies of official recognition that served both to reward achievement and to reinforce party authority through control over the distribution of honors. The post-Soviet Russian Federation's restoration of many Tsarist-era orders, alongside retention of Soviet decorations, illustrates how honors systems reflect complex negotiations between different historical traditions, competing claims to legitimacy, with contemporary Russian honors incorporating elements from imperial, Soviet, and post-communist periods into a syncretic system that serves current political purposes while evoking multiple historical associations. The honors systems of Commonwealth realms, including Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, evolved from initial reliance on British honors toward the creation of distinctive national orders that assert independent national identities while maintaining connections to shared Commonwealth traditions, with the specific balance between continuity and innovation varying according to domestic political dynamics and the strength of Republican versus monarchist sentiment. The Canadian Order of Canada, established in 1967 during centennial celebrations, created a distinctly national honour that recognised contributions to Canadian society without reference to British traditions, though appointments to the order remain made by the Governor-General, representing the Canadian monarch, in a system that preserves constitutional connections to the Crown while asserting national autonomy in honours distribution. The Australian decision to create the Order of Australia in 1975, while initially retaining British honours, including knighthoods, followed by the cessation of recommendations for British honours in 1983, and the brief controversial reintroduction of Australian knighthoods between 2014 and 2015, illustrates ongoing debates about appropriate forms of recognition in societies, with divided loyalties between republican principles and traditional institutions. The New Zealand honours system reformed in 1996 to create distinctly New Zealand orders, while eliminating titular honours, followed by the restoration of titular honours, including knighthoods, through a 2009 referendum, demonstrates how honours systems remain contested political terrain, where competing visions of national identity and appropriate recognition mechanisms generate ongoing controversy and periodic reforms. The multiplication of international honours, including various United Nations decorations, the Nobel Prizes established by Alfred Nobel's will and awarded by Swedish and Norwegian institutions, and the European Union's Charlemagne Prize, creates transnational recognition mechanisms that operate alongside national honours systems, while potentially undermining their exclusive authority to confer distinction and define achievement. The proliferation of private and professional honours, including industry awards, foundation prizes, and recognition by non-governmental organisations, creates a competitive marketplace for prestige, where official state honours constitute only one among many mechanisms through which achievement receives recognition and distinction gets conferred, potentially diluting the significance of governmental honours, while demonstrating the universal human desire for formal acknowledgement of accomplishment. The question of whether official honours retain distinctive authority and prestige compared to private recognitions depends partly on the perceived legitimacy of the granting authority, partly on the selectivity and rigour of selection processes, and partly on broader cultural attitudes toward governmental institutions and traditional forms of recognition. The persistence of honours systems across virtually all modern nation-states, despite their apparent incongruity with meritocratic principles and egalitarian ideologies, suggests that they serve fundamental social functions, including the Sikheid, public celebration of achievement, the encouragement of service, the reinforcement of social hierarchies, and the creation of bonds between honoured individuals and the state that granted recognition. The comparative study of honours systems reveals both universal patterns in how societies construct mechanisms for conferring distinction and significant variations, reflecting different political traditions, cultural values, historical experiences, and social structures, with the specific forms that recognition takes, shaped by complex interactions between functional requirements, cultural inheritances, and contemporary political dynamics. The transformation of British knighthood from a functional military role into a mechanism for recognizing diverse forms of achievement while retaining medieval terminology and ceremonial elements, represents only one possible evolutionary trajectory among many alternatives, as demonstrated by societies that created entirely new forms of recognition, divorced from feudal antecedents, or that adapted different historical traditions to modern purposes. The survival of British knighthood through centuries of social transformation, while honours systems in other countries underwent fundamental reorganisations or complete replacement, suggests that institutional persistence depends not only on the services institutions provide, but also on the strength of cultural attachments to traditional forms and the success of ongoing adaptations that maintain relevance while preserving continuity. The fact that British knighthood remains internationally recognised and comprehensible despite its distinctive characteristics testifies both to the global influence of British cultural forms during the imperial period and to the continuing appeal of medieval chivalric imagery that transcends national boundaries through literature, entertainment, and popular culture that keeps alive romantic associations with knights and chivalric values. The ultimate significance of knighthood's thousand-year evolution from Anglo-Saxon thegness through Norman Conquest and feudal military service to contemporary honorific dignity lies less in the specific institutional transformations than in what this remarkable persistence reveals about the nature of social institutions, the relationship between form and function, the mechanisms through which traditions maintain authority, and the ways human societies construct and maintain hierarchies of distinction across profound historical changes. The complete transformation of knighthood's function, while preserving its name and ceremonial associations, demonstrates that institutions can survive indefinitely through continuous adaptation that maintains nominal continuity, serving entirely different purposes, suggesting that successful institutions persist not despite, but because of their flexibility in redefining themselves for successive generations. The preservation of medieval terminology, symbolism, and ceremonial forms within a thoroughly modern recognition system reveals the enduring power of historical associations and the human affinity for tradition, even when the substance of institutions has been completely transformed, indicating that cultural forms possess a kind of momentum that enables them to persist long after their original contexts and purposes have disappeared. The trajectory from mounted warriors performing feudal military service to scientists, artists, and public servants receiving ceremonial recognition at palace investitures illustrates how profoundly social needs and values can change while institutional structures nominally remain constant, demonstrating the distinction between the surface continuity of institutional forms and the fundamental transformations of their meanings and functions. The fact that contemporary knighthood retains cultural significance and social prestige, despite bearing no relationship whatever to medieval military service, testifies to the success of continuous adaptations that kept the institution relevant to changing social circumstances while preserving sufficient connection to historical traditions to maintain claims to legitimacy and authority. The persistence of debates about whether knighthoods should be retained, reformed, or abolished indicates that even thoroughly transformed institutions remain contested terrain, where competing visions of appropriate recognition mechanisms and proper relationships between achievement and distinction continue to generate controversy, suggesting that questions about how societies should recognize and reward achievement remain fundamentally unresolved, even in ostensibly meritocratic democracies. The comparative international perspective on honours systems reveals that British knighthood represents only one among many possible solutions to universal challenges of constructing mechanisms for conferring official recognition. Yet its particular combination of historical depth, ceremonial distinctiveness, and successful adaptation has enabled it to survive circumstances that led to fundamental reorganizations or complete abandonment of honours systems in many other societies. The continuing appeal of chivalric imagery and medieval symbolism in contemporary popular culture, independent of actual knightly institutions, demonstrates that the cultural associations of knighthood have achieved a kind of autonomous existence divorced from the institutional realities, creating a mythological dimension that coexists with and possibly reinforces the actual honours system, while also potentially undermining it through promotion of romantic fantasies disconnected from historical realities. The scholarly debates about knighthood's origins, evolution, and significance reflect broader methodological and theoretical controversies within historical studies, revealing how a single institution can serve as a site where fundamental questions about the relationships between military organization and social structure, between ideology and material interests, and between cultural meanings and social functions remain productively contested after centuries of investigation. The transformation of knighthood from military necessity to social distinction to honorific recognition, while maintaining nominal institutional continuity, provides a paradigmatic example of how human societies manage change through adaptation rather than replacement of established forms, suggesting general principles about institutional evolution that may apply beyond the specific case of English knighthood to illuminate broader patterns of social and cultural transformation. The enduring fascination with knights and chivalry, evidenced by their persistent presence in literature, film, games, and various forms of cultural production centuries after the disappearance of actual medieval mounted warriors, indicates that certain historical phenomena achieve symbolic significance that transcends their original contexts, becoming permanent fixtures of cultural imagination that continue to shape values, aspirations, and self-understandings long after the institutions they ostensibly represent have ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The ultimate lesson of knighthood's thousand-year evolution may be that successful institutions survive not through rigid preservation of original forms and functions, but through creative adaptation that maintains just enough continuity with tradition to preserve legitimacy, while transforming substance sufficiently to remain relevant to changing social needs. A balancing act that requires constant negotiation between conservation and innovation, between respect for inheritance and recognition of present requirements. The institution of knighthood in all its iterations, from Anglo-Saxon military organization through Norman feudalism and medieval chivalry, to Tudor social honors and contemporary recognition of diverse achievements, represents a continuous thread connecting past and present, demonstrating how societies maintain connections to their histories while adapting inherited forms to serve contemporary purposes, creating complex layered institutions that simultaneously embody multiple historical periods and current social functions in ways that enable them to serve as bridges between tradition and modernity.